Welcome back to the Jesus Stories channel. Today we bring you a new story, the complete story of Ezekiel, the prophet who saw God leave the temple. Please take a moment to like and subscribe to the channel. The content of this video has been compiled from various sources, so if there are any omissions or inaccuracies, please feel free to leave a comment and share your insights. Thank you. And now, let's begin the story. A man loses his homeland, his future, his purpose, and then begins claiming he has seen the throne of God moving through the heavens on wheels of fire. Most people would call that madness, but in the ruins of ancient Israel, during one of the darkest crises in biblical history, Ezekiel emerged with visions so strange, so overwhelming, and so unforgettable that even thousands of years later, scholars, theologians, and skeptics still wrestle with what he saw. Was he simply a traumatized exile trying to make sense of catastrophe? Or was he truly a prophet witnessing the terrifying reality of divine judgment and impossible hope? Because Ezekiel's story is not just the story of bizarre visions and symbolic acts. It is the story of a priest who never got to serve in the temple, a husband asked to endure unimaginable loss, a watchman sent to warn a nation already collapsing, and a witness to one of the most devastating moments in Jewish history. From the fall of Jerusalem to the valley of dry bones, from the departure of God's glory to the promise of restoration. This is not merely one prophet's biography. This is the complete story of judgment, exile, survival, and the radical question of whether dead things can live again. To understand Ezekiel, we must begin not with the prophet himself, but with the slow destruction of the world that created him. Because Ezekiel did not emerge during a time of peace, stability, or religious confidence. He was born into a civilization already trembling beneath the pressure of empires, political miscalculations, spiritual corruption, and historical forces far larger than any one individual could control. By the time his voice enters the biblical record, the kingdom of Judah was no longer a rising nation with confidence in its covenant identity. It was a frightened remnant living in the shadow of collapse. For generations, the people of Judah had defined themselves through a powerful theological certainty. Jerusalem was the city of God. The temple was the earthly dwelling place of the divine presence. The descendants of David still sat, at least in theory, on a throne tied to sacred promises. This was not merely politics. It was worldview. It was identity. It was the lens through which reality itself was interpreted. But history has a way of testing theological assumptions with brutal force. The story begins in the late 7th century before Christ, during one of Judah's final moments of hope. King Josiah, remembered in biblical tradition as a reformer, attempted to reverse decades of religious corruption. According to the narrative preserved in Kings, idolatrous practices were purged, covenant reforms were enacted, and worship was centralized in Jerusalem. For a brief moment, it may have seemed possible that Judah could return to covenant faithfulness and national stability. But Josiah's death changed everything. In 609 BCE, at Megiddo, Josiah confronted Pharaoh Necho of Egypt and was killed. His death created not only a political vacuum, but a theological shock. If a righteous king could fall, what exactly did divine protection mean? Judah suddenly became vulnerable to international powers fighting for dominance across the ancient Near East. To understand this crisis, we must widen the lens beyond Jerusalem. The Assyrian Empire, once the terrifying superpower of the region, was collapsing. Into that vacuum stepped two major contenders, Egypt and Babylon. This was not simply a regional power struggle. It was the reshaping of the geopolitical world Ezekiel inherited. Babylon, under Nebuchadnezzar II, emerged as the dominant force after the decisive Battle of Carchemish in 605 BCE, where Egyptian influence was effectively broken. Judah now found itself trapped in the path of imperial expansion. Small kingdoms caught between empires often survived through fragile diplomacy, tribute, and strategic submission. But Judah's leadership repeatedly made dangerous calculations. Some hoped for Egyptian support. Others believed divine protection guaranteed Jerusalem's survival regardless of political reality. This combination of bad geopolitics and misplaced religious confidence proved catastrophic. Babylon first moved against Judah during the reign of Jehoiakim. Tribute was imposed. Political subservience became reality. But rebellion followed. That rebellion triggered Babylonian intervention. In 597 BCE, Nebuchadnezzar captured Jerusalem. King Jehoiakim was removed. Members of the royal family, military elites, craftsmen, and skilled individuals were deported to Babylon. This was not yet the final destruction, but it was a devastating humiliation. Among those taken into exile was a young man named Ezekiel. And here the personal dimension becomes crucial. Ezekiel was not simply another displaced citizen. He appears to have belonged to a priestly family. The opening verse of the book of Ezekiel identifies him as the son of Buzi the priest. That matters enormously. In ancient Judah, priesthood was not merely an occupation. It was inherited vocation, sacred identity, communal responsibility, and theological purpose, all bound together. A priest's life was structured around the temple. Ritual purity, sacrificial systems, sacred rhythms, liturgical duty, and covenant mediation shaped existence itself. If Ezekiel was around 30 years old when his prophetic ministry began, as many interpreters suggest based on the chronology in the text, then exile may have struck precisely when he expected to begin full priestly service. Imagine that psychological rupture. A man raised for sacred service, trained for a life in the presence of God, suddenly uprooted from the only place that vocation could be fulfilled. The temple remained in Jerusalem. Ezekiel was in Babylon. The world he expected had ended before it truly began. But exile in Babylon was not necessarily slavery in the simplistic, cinematic sense many modern viewers imagine. Babylonian deportation policy was strategic. Empires relocated populations to weaken rebellion, redistribute skilled labor, and integrate conquered peoples into imperial systems. Exiles often lived in organized settlements under supervision, rather than chained in dungeons. Ezekiel himself would later be located among the exiles by the river Chebar, likely within a deportee community. Yet, psychological displacement can be as devastating as physical captivity. The deeper question haunting the exiles was theological. Had their God been defeated? Ancient warfare was often interpreted in religious terms. If Babylon conquered Jerusalem, did that mean Babylon's gods were stronger than Yahweh? Or had Yahweh abandoned his own people? Worse still, many likely believed Jerusalem's suffering was temporary. Surely the temple would stand. Surely restoration would come quickly. Surely divine promises could not fail. But those assumptions were about to be shattered. Ezekiel's generation stood in one of history's most dangerous emotional spaces, the gap between false hope and impending catastrophe. Back in Jerusalem, Babylon installed Zedekiah as a client king. Stability was theoretically possible. Submission to Babylon might have preserved what remained. But resistance continued brewing. Political leaders still gambled with survival. Religious voices likely continued proclaiming confidence. Jeremiah, Ezekiel's prophetic contemporary in Jerusalem, fiercely opposed those illusions. Ezekiel, from exile, would soon do the same. This matters because Ezekiel's prophetic message cannot be understood apart from this collision between expectation and reality. He was not speaking into abstract spirituality. He was speaking into national trauma, into denial, into theological confusion, into a people desperately trying to preserve old assumptions while history dismantled them piece by piece. Before Ezekiel ever saw a vision of living creatures or wheels within wheels, he first experienced the collapse of everything familiar. Empire had redrawn the map. Sacred geography no longer felt secure. Political leadership had failed. National identity was fractured. And for a priest without a temple, even the categories through which God had once been understood seemed unstable. This is where Ezekiel's story truly begins, not with certainty, but with dislocation, not with clarity, but with collapse. Because sometimes the most transformative revelations do not come when a world is strong. They come when that world has already fallen apart. When Ezekiel arrived in Babylon, he entered a world that was both less visibly brutal and far more psychologically devastating than many modern imaginations assume. Popular depictions often reduce exile to chains, whips, and dungeon walls, but the Babylonian imperial system was more sophisticated than that. Its cruelty was strategic, administrative, and deeply disorienting. The empire did not always destroy conquered peoples by immediate extermination. Often, it dismantled them by removing them from the landscapes, institutions, and cultural structures that gave their identity meaning. This was the world Ezekiel inherited. He was no longer standing in Jerusalem beneath the symbolic shadow of the temple. He was living hundreds of miles away in the heartland of a foreign empire, whose gods, architecture, language, and political power dominated everything around him. And perhaps the most terrifying part was this: life continued. The sun still rose, markets still functioned, fields still required labor, families still ate, slept, argued, mourned, and tried to survive. Catastrophe had not ended history. It had simply relocated it. This kind of displacement creates a unique emotional fracture. Physical suffering can be immediate and obvious. Identity erosion is slower, more intimate, more haunting. The Babylonian deportees were not necessarily treated as chained prisoners in permanent cells. Historical evidence suggests many exiles lived in organized settlements, functioning communities under imperial oversight. Administrative texts from Mesopotamia indicate relocated populations could work, marry, maintain households, and participate in economic life, though always within structures they did not control. This matters because Ezekiel's experience was not merely one of physical confinement. It was the experience of cultural exile, existing but uprooted, living but dislocated. The book of Ezekiel places him among the deportees by the river Chebar, likely part of an irrigation canal network in Babylonian territory, rather than a wild, natural river in the modern sense. This was not the Jerusalem he knew. There were no temple courts, no sacred pilgrim rhythms, no priestly processions, no visible signs that the covenant geography of Israel still held cosmic meaning. For a priest, this was existential devastation. Because priests were not wandering spiritual teachers detached from place. Their identity was inseparable from sacred space. Temple service was not portable. It required altar systems, ritual structures, sacrificial procedures, purity regulations, inherited responsibilities, and covenant geography. Ezekiel had not simply lost his home. He had lost the framework through which his entire future made sense. Imagine preparing your whole life for one sacred calling, only to discover history has made that calling impossible before it begins. Yet Ezekiel was not alone in this dislocation. Thousands shared his exile, and collective trauma creates its own emotional ecosystem. Some likely mourned openly, others clung to denial. Some interpreted events politically, others spiritually. Some may have blamed leadership, others blamed themselves. But perhaps one of the most powerful forces shaping the exile community was hope. Not healthy hope, but desperate hope, built on fragile assumptions. Many likely believed their displacement would be temporary. Jerusalem still stood. The temple had not yet been destroyed. The Davidic line still technically existed through the puppet king Zedekiah. Surely this humiliation was only a brief interruption. Surely Babylon would weaken. Surely God would intervene. False hope can be emotionally comforting in the short term, but devastating when reality refuses to cooperate. This tension forms the emotional background of Ezekiel's early ministry. The exiles did not yet fully understand the scale of what was coming. They had suffered catastrophe, but not final catastrophe. And because of that, denial remained possible. Psalm 137, though reflecting later exile memory, captures the emotional atmosphere powerfully. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat and wept when we remembered Zion. That image is not merely poetic grief. It reflects the fracture of sacred memory. Zion was not simply a city. It was theological orientation. It was national identity. It was covenant imagination. To remember Zion from Babylon was to feel the unbearable contradiction between promise and reality. Meanwhile, Babylon itself projected overwhelming imperial confidence. This was one of the most impressive urban civilizations of the ancient world. Massive architecture, monumental religious structures, administrative sophistication, political power on a global scale by ancient standards. For Judean exiles arriving from a defeated small kingdom, Babylon was not merely foreign, it was intimidating. Every visible structure proclaimed the same message: empire wins. And this raised a dangerous theological question. If Yahweh was truly sovereign, why were his people here? Ancient people did not neatly separate politics from theology the way many modern secular frameworks do. Military defeat often implied divine weakness or divine judgment. If Babylon conquered Jerusalem, what exactly had happened? Had Yahweh been defeated by Babylon's gods? Had he abandoned his covenant? Had the people misunderstood everything? Ezekiel's future visions would answer those questions dramatically. But at this stage, uncertainty dominated. The silence itself was oppressive. And then there was Ezekiel, the individual. Before he became the prophet of astonishing visions, he was simply a displaced man living among displaced people. The text later reveals his extraordinary calling, but at this stage he would have appeared externally as one exile among many. Yet internal crises often prepare the ground for radical transformation. Historical trauma destabilizes old certainties. It forces new theological questions. It strips away inherited assumptions. For some, this creates despair. For others, revelation. Ezekiel stood at that threshold. It is also important to understand that exile in biblical theology was not merely geographic punishment. It echoed older covenant warnings embedded in Israel's own traditions. Deuteronomic theology repeatedly framed covenant rebellion as something that could result in displacement from the land. In that sense, exile was not random history. It could be interpreted as covenant consequence. But that interpretation was emotionally unbearable, because it suggested the disaster was not simply political misfortune. It was theological reckoning. And yet, even in judgment, a question remained unresolved. Could God still be encountered outside the land? This was perhaps the deepest crisis of all. Ancient Israel's religious imagination was profoundly tied to sacred geography. Jerusalem mattered. The temple mattered. Land mattered. If those anchors were gone, what remained? Could divine presence cross borders? Could covenant identity survive imperial relocation? Could a priest without a temple still matter? These are not abstract theological puzzles. They are the emotional and spiritual conditions from which Ezekiel's prophetic mission emerged. Before the wheels of fire, before the living creatures, before the terrifying voice, there was simply silence among exiles waiting for answers. Watching canals instead of temple courts, listening to foreign languages instead of sacred songs, wondering whether history had disproven everything they believed. And it is precisely there, in that space of uncertainty, displacement, and unresolved grief, that Ezekiel's story is about to take its most extraordinary turn. 5 years into exile, in a land that should have represented divine absence, Ezekiel saw something that shattered every theological assumption his generation still clung to. The opening chapter of the book of Ezekiel does not begin like ordinary prophetic literature. There is no gradual introduction, no gentle transition, no soft poetic meditation. It begins with disruption, a violent interruption of reality itself. Ezekiel tells us he was among the exiles by the river Chebar, when the heavens were opened and he saw visions of God. That sentence alone would have been shocking enough, but what follows is one of the most visually overwhelming and symbolically dense passages in all biblical literature. And to understand its power, we must first understand what Ezekiel expected not to happen. If divine presence was tied to Jerusalem, if the temple represented the earthly center of God's dwelling, then Babylon should have been the wrong place for such an encounter. This was enemy territory. This was exile. This was the geography of humiliation. And yet, this is exactly where the heavens open. That detail changes everything. Ezekiel begins with storm imagery. He sees a great windstorm coming from the north, a massive cloud flashing with fire, radiance surrounding it, glowing brilliance at its center like molten metal. Ancient audiences would immediately recognize storm theophany language. Throughout the ancient Near East, storms were associated with divine power. In biblical tradition as well, overwhelming weather imagery often signaled divine manifestation. But Ezekiel's vision quickly becomes stranger than standard symbolic language. Emerging from the fire are 4 living creatures. Their description is deliberately destabilizing. Each has human form, yet each has 4 faces: human, lion, ox, and eagle. Each has 4 wings. Their legs are straight. Their feet resemble polished bronze. Human hands appear beneath their wings. Their movement is unnatural, direct, precise, unstoppable. They do not turn as they move. Already the imagery feels less like natural observation and more like symbolic overload. Ezekiel is not giving us ordinary description. He is struggling to narrate the indescribable. This matters because modern readers often approach such texts with the wrong question, asking what exactly did Ezekiel physically see, as if the passage were a camera report. Ancient visionary literature does not function that way. Symbolic description communicates theological meaning as much as visual impression. The creatures likely evoke layered symbolic associations: human intelligence, lion-like majesty, ox-like strength, eagle-like transcendence. Later biblical tradition would revisit related imagery, but Ezekiel's immediate point is clear. He is witnessing a reality beyond ordinary categories. Then the vision escalates. Beside each creature appears a wheel, but not an ordinary wheel. A wheel intersecting another wheel, creating movement in multiple directions without turning. The wheels gleam like precious stone. Most disturbing of all, they are covered with eyes. Eyes everywhere. For modern audiences, this can feel surreal, even bizarre. For ancient theological imagination, the symbolism likely communicates perception, awareness, omnidirectional sovereignty, and relentless mobility. Nothing escapes divine sight. No direction limits divine movement. No territory confines divine authority. The vision is unsettling because it is meant to be. Ezekiel's God is not static, domesticated, or geographically trapped. The creatures and wheels move in total synchronization, animated by the same spirit. Above them stretches an expanse like dazzling crystal. Above that, a throne. And above the throne, something Ezekiel repeatedly describes with careful hesitation: the appearance of a human-like figure. This linguistic caution is important. Ezekiel does not claim simplistic visual certainty. His language is saturated with phrases like the likeness of, the appearance of, something like. This is theological restraint, not confusion. He is trying to describe transcendent encounter without pretending full comprehension. The figure radiates fiery brilliance. Light surrounds the throne like a rainbow in clouds after rain. And then Ezekiel understands. This is the appearance of a likeness of the glory of the Lord. Notice the layering: appearance, likeness, glory. Ezekiel carefully protects divine transcendence even while affirming genuine encounter. The result is overwhelming. He falls face down. That response is entirely consistent with biblical theophany tradition. Direct encounter with divine majesty is not inspiring in the casual, modern sense. It is destabilizing, terrifying, overwhelming. But why this imagery? Why not a simpler revelation? Because Ezekiel's first message is not delivered through speech. It is delivered through theology made visual. Every major symbolic element confronts exile assumptions. First, divine mobility. In the ancient world, deities were often associated with territories, temples, or national boundaries. If a people lost their land, questions naturally emerged about divine power. Ezekiel's vision answers that immediately. Yahweh is not trapped in Jerusalem. His throne moves. His sovereignty travels. Babylon is not outside his reach. Second, divine perception. The many eyes communicate awareness. Exile may feel like abandonment, but nothing has escaped divine sight. Third, divine kingship. The throne imagery establishes cosmic authority. Babylon may appear politically supreme, but imperial power is not ultimate reality. There is a higher throne. Scholars have noted possible visual parallels between Ezekiel's imagery and ancient Near Eastern throne symbolism, including hybrid guardian creatures known from Mesopotamian and Levantine contexts. This does not reduce Ezekiel's vision to borrowed mythology. Rather, it suggests visionary language communicated within recognizable symbolic frameworks while radically redefining them around Israel's God. Ezekiel is not copying Babylonian religion. He is proclaiming Yahweh's supremacy in a world saturated with imperial symbolism. Some modern interpreters attempt psychological readings, suggesting trauma, altered states, or symbolic visionary consciousness shaped the experience. Others focus strictly on literary theology. Faith traditions emphasize genuine prophetic revelation. These interpretive frameworks differ, but one fact remains constant. The text intentionally presents this as a transformative encounter that redefines Ezekiel's mission and theology. The emotional significance for Ezekiel personally cannot be overstated. Remember who he is: a displaced priest, a man severed from sacred geography, a member of a defeated people living under imperial domination. And then, in exile, he encounters not divine silence, but overwhelming divine presence. Not in Jerusalem, not in the temple, in Babylon. That is the theological earthquake at the heart of Ezekiel chapter 1. The exiled community likely assumed geography determined spiritual possibility. Ezekiel's vision demolishes that assumption. God has not been defeated. God has not been immobilized. God has not vanished. If anything, the vision suggests something even more unsettling. The catastrophe itself may be unfolding within divine sovereignty. This changes the entire story. Exile is no longer merely political tragedy. It becomes theological confrontation. The God Ezekiel encounters is not a weakened national deity clinging to ruined territory. He is cosmic, mobile, terrifyingly alive, and fully present in the place everyone assumed was spiritually abandoned. Before Ezekiel ever speaks a word of judgment or hope, this is the truth his audience must confront. The throne is still occupied, and it moves. After witnessing the overwhelming vision of the living throne, Ezekiel does not rise as a triumphant spiritual hero eager to embrace his destiny. He collapses face down in the dust. That detail matters because biblical prophetic calling is rarely portrayed as glamorous. Modern audiences sometimes imagine prophets as charismatic religious leaders confidently stepping into influence, but the biblical pattern is far more unsettling. Genuine encounter with the divine does not inflate the ego. It crushes human certainty. Isaiah cries out in terror over his uncleanness. Jeremiah protests his inadequacy and youth. Moses argues that he cannot speak properly. And now Ezekiel, a displaced priest already carrying the trauma of exile, finds himself drafted into a mission he almost certainly did not seek. Because what happens next is not comfort, it is commissioning. A voice speaks. Ezekiel is addressed with a title that will define his prophetic identity throughout the book: Son of Man. The phrase emphasizes mortality, humanity, frailty. In the shadow of the cosmic throne, Ezekiel is reminded of exactly what he is: not divine, not powerful, not sovereign, but human. This repeated designation becomes one of the most striking rhetorical features of the book. Again and again, Ezekiel will be called Son of Man, not as an insult, but as theological grounding. The messenger may carry divine words, but he remains dust and breath. Then comes the command, stand up. Yet even this first act of obedience requires divine empowerment. The Spirit enters him and sets him on his feet. Ezekiel is not portrayed as summoning courage from inner strength. He is acted upon. Strength comes from outside himself. This is a crucial pattern in prophetic literature. Calling is not self-generated ambition. It is divine interruption. The message he receives is deeply discouraging. He is being sent not to a receptive audience hungry for truth, but to a rebellious house. The language is severe. The people are described as stubborn, defiant, resistant, covenant breakers. This is not merely political rebellion against Babylon. It is theological rebellion against God. And Ezekiel is warned from the beginning that resistance will define his ministry. This warning strips away illusion. He is not being sent to lead a revival campaign with predictable success. He is being sent into hostility. The instruction is stark. Whether they listen or refuse to listen, they will know a prophet has been among them. Success is not defined by response. Success is defined by faithful witness. That distinction would have been psychologically brutal. Most human beings measure purpose through visible impact. Ezekiel is being told that obedience matters more than outcome. Worse still, the imagery intensifies. He is told not to fear them, though briars, thorns, and scorpions surround him. This is symbolic language of danger, hostility, pain, and emotional threat. His ministry will wound him. The warning is honest. No false promises, no assurances of popularity, no guarantee of institutional validation. Then comes one of the most unforgettable moments in prophetic literature. Ezekiel sees a scroll. Written on both sides, already unusual in the ancient world where scrolls typically carried writing on one side. The message is fullness, completeness, overwhelming content. And what fills this scroll? Lamentation, mourning, and woe, judgment, grief, catastrophe. Then comes the shocking command: eat the scroll, internalize the message, consume it, let it become part of you. This is not merely symbolic theater. It communicates a profound prophetic principle. Ezekiel is not to function as a detached courier mechanically delivering information. The word must enter him. It must shape his inner life before it reaches others. Prophetic speech is not external performance. It is embodied proclamation. Yet here the symbolism becomes paradoxical. Though the scroll contains judgment, Ezekiel says it tastes as sweet as honey. Why sweetness? Interpretations vary, but the likely meaning is not that judgment itself is emotionally delightful. Rather, divine revelation, even when severe, carries a strange sweetness, because encounter with truth is itself life-giving. To receive authentic divine word is meaningful. even when the content is painful. This mirrors older biblical motifs, where God's word is nourishing, sustaining, and precious despite its demands. Ezekiel has now moved beyond observer. He has become participant. But the psychological burden only deepens. He is sent specifically to the house of Israel, not to foreign peoples with unfamiliar languages. Ironically, God says foreign nations might have listened more readily. The problem is not communication difficulty. It is hardness of heart. This is one of the bleakest aspects of prophetic ministry. The obstacle is not misunderstanding. It is resistance. So God responds with a disturbing promise. Ezekiel's forehead will be made as hard as theirs. Hard against hard. Stubbornness meeting divinely reinforced resilience. This is not a call to cruelty. It is preparation for endurance. Softness alone would not survive this mission. The emotional strain would crush him. He will need unnatural perseverance. Then comes another extraordinary moment. The Spirit lifts him. The sound behind him is immense, the glory of the Lord moving, the thunder of living creatures and wheels. The visionary experience remains active, dynamic, overwhelming. Ezekiel is not transitioning from mystical encounter into ordinary life. He is being carried through an altered theological reality where divine presence has shattered old assumptions. Yet the emotional response is revealing. He says he went in bitterness and in the heat of his spirit, with the hand of the Lord strong upon him. This is not serene acceptance. This is emotional turmoil. The Hebrew language suggests agitation, inner disturbance, perhaps even resistance. Ezekiel is not portrayed as cheerfully embracing the mission. He is overwhelmed, conflicted, driven. This honesty makes the narrative psychologically compelling. Prophetic calling does not erase human struggle, it intensifies it. When he arrives among the exiles at Tel Abib, he sits stunned for 7 days, silent, overwhelmed. The duration likely echoes ritual mourning patterns. This is important. Ezekiel's commissioning is not merely functional, it is traumatic. Revelation has not simply informed him, it has destabilized him. Only after this silence comes the next defining commission. He is appointed a watchman. The metaphor would have been immediately understood in the ancient world. A watchman stands on the walls scanning for danger, responsible to sound warning. Failure carries consequences. If danger comes and no warning is given, blood is required. Applied spiritually, the meaning is severe. Ezekiel is accountable to speak. Silence becomes moral failure. But notice the burden this creates. He is responsible for warning, not for controlling response. If the wicked refuse, that is on them. If he fails to speak, responsibility shifts to him. This is enormous psychological pressure. His words are not casual commentary. They carry covenant consequence. Then comes, perhaps, the strangest feature of this early calling. Ezekiel is told he will become mute, except when given divine speech. Scholars debate exact interpretation, whether literal speech impairment, symbolic restriction, selective prophetic silence, or literary theological motif. But the narrative function is powerful regardless. Ezekiel will not be an ordinary public religious commentator constantly voicing opinion. Speech belongs to divine timing. Silence itself becomes part of the message. For a prophet, this is extraordinary. For a priest trained in liturgical structure and sacred communication, it is even more striking. By the end of this chapter, Ezekiel has undergone complete transformation. He began as a displaced exile priest. He is now something else entirely. A watchman, a bearer of judgment, a man who has consumed the word, a witness bound to divine speech. Yet nothing about this transformation feels triumphant in conventional terms. It feels heavy, dangerous, costly, which may be exactly the point. Because the true prophet is not the one who seeks the platform. He is the one who cannot escape the burden once the voice has spoken. If Ezekiel's calling established him as a prophet, his next actions ensured no one would mistake him for an ordinary religious teacher. Because Ezekiel did not simply preach sermons, he performed messages. He embodied warnings. He transformed his own body, daily life, and public behavior into living prophecy. To modern audiences, these actions can seem bizarre, even disturbing. But in the symbolic world of ancient prophetic communication, dramatic sign acts were not random acts of madness. They were intentional theological theater. Jeremiah wore yokes. Isaiah walked stripped as a sign. Hosea's personal life itself became prophetic symbolism. Yet even within that tradition, Ezekiel's actions are among the most extreme. And that is precisely the point. Ordinary language was no longer enough. The people were too resistant, too numb, too committed to denial. So the warning had to become impossible to ignore. The first major sign act begins with what sounds almost like a child's object lesson, but quickly becomes something far more unsettling. Ezekiel is instructed to take a clay tablet and draw the city of Jerusalem on it. Then he must stage a miniature siege against it, constructing symbolic siege works, ramps, camps, and battering rams. Imagine the visual impact. An exile priest kneeling in Babylon, building a symbolic war model of the holy city itself. This was not entertainment. It was public theological confrontation. Jerusalem, the city many still believed divinely untouchable, was being represented as a doomed target. But Ezekiel is not finished. He places an iron plate between himself and the city, like an impenetrable barrier. Interpretations differ, but the symbolism likely suggests divine opposition, separation, or the inevitability of judgment. The message is devastating. The siege is not merely Babylon's doing. God himself stands in judicial opposition. Then comes perhaps the most physically demanding prophetic sign in the entire Hebrew Bible. Ezekiel is commanded to lie on his side for extended periods, first on the left, then on the right, symbolically bearing the guilt of Israel and Judah. The exact numerical symbolism has generated enormous scholarly debate, involving covenant reckoning, symbolic year calculations, textual complexities, and interpretive disputes. But whatever the precise arithmetic, the central point is unmistakable. Judgment has accumulated over time. Covenant breach carries weight, and Ezekiel's body becomes the visible canvas of that reality. Modern readers naturally ask practical questions. Did he literally remain immobilized continuously? Were these staged periods repeated daily? Was a language visionary, symbolic, hyperbolic, ritualized? Scholars disagree, but the narrative intent is clear regardless of implementation. The sign act communicates prolonged burden, public endurance, and embodied warning. Imagine exile communities watching this man repeatedly assume this strange posture day after day. Confusion would be inevitable, conversation unavoidable. Prophetic theater works because it creates disruption, but the humiliation deepens. Ezekiel receives strict food rations measured by weight and water measured by volume. Scarcity is being dramatized. This is siege survival. Hunger quantified, controlled consumption. Every meal becomes symbolic performance. Then comes one of the most controversial commands in the book. Ezekiel is instructed to bake bread over human dung, symbolizing ritual defilement and desperate conditions. For a priest shaped by purity laws, this would have been emotionally and religiously revolting. Ezekiel protests, noting his lifelong concern for ritual cleanliness. This moment matters because it reveals something often overlooked. Ezekiel is not emotionally numb. He resists. He reacts. He remains deeply formed by priestly consciousness. In response, the instruction is modified to cow dung. The symbolism remains powerful. The people will eat defiled food among the nations. Exile is not merely relocation. It is ritual disorientation. For ancient Israelite identity, food, purity, and sacred boundaries mattered profoundly. This sign communicates not only physical hardship, but covenant dislocation. Then comes another shocking act. Ezekiel is told to shave his head and beard with a sword. To modern viewers, this may seem merely strange. In Ezekiel's world, it was loaded with meaning. Priestly traditions often treated such actions with seriousness. Hair could symbolize dignity, identity, mourning, and consecration. The use of a sword intensifies the imagery. Ezekiel then divides the hair into portions, some burned, some struck with the sword, some scattered to the wind. A small portion preserved, though even some of that later subjected to fire. This is visual judgment theology. Different fates await Jerusalem's inhabitants: death by famine, violence, dispersion, fragile remnant survival. No lengthy sermon required. The symbolism is brutally clear. What makes these acts especially effective is their cumulative effect. One strange behavior might be dismissed. Repeated symbolic performances become impossible to ignore. Ezekiel is constructing a prophetic atmosphere where denial becomes harder to maintain. Every action says the same thing in different form. Catastrophe is coming, and your assumptions are wrong. This style of communication also reflects a deeper theological reality. Biblical prophecy is not merely about information transfer. It is about confrontation. Data alone rarely changes hardened hearts. Symbolic disruption can bypass intellectual defenses. It forces emotional engagement. It creates memorable images that linger long after arguments fade. In that sense, Ezekiel is a master of prophetic visual rhetoric. Yet we should not romanticize this. These performances carried personal cost: public humiliation, social alienation, potential ridicule, questions about sanity, loss of normal social standing. Imagine children staring, neighbors whispering, fellow exiles debating whether trauma had broken him. Prophetic obedience often looks irrational before events validate the warning. This raises a deeper interpretive question. Why such extreme symbolism at all? Because Ezekiel's audience was not spiritually neutral. They were resistant. Many still believed Jerusalem would survive. Many likely trusted in temple security, covenant status, political reversal, or prophetic optimism from other voices. Straightforward warning had competitors. Ezekiel's sign acts shattered normal communication patterns precisely because normal persuasion was failing. There is also something profoundly incarnational about Ezekiel's ministry. The message is not detached from the messenger. He does not merely announce suffering. He physically enacts burden, deprivation, humiliation, and disruption. His own body becomes part of the prophetic text. That gives his ministry disturbing authenticity. He is not warning from comfort. He is participating in symbolic suffering. Scholars sometimes compare these acts with broader ancient Near Eastern symbolic rituals, though Ezekiel's theological framework remains distinctively Israelite. What matters narratively is that prophetic communication here becomes public drama with covenant meaning. The strange behavior is not random spectacle, it is theological sign language. And yet, the tragedy is this: dramatic warning does not guarantee repentance. Human beings are remarkably capable of interpreting disturbing signs in ways that preserve existing beliefs. The more unsettling the messenger, the easier it can be to dismiss him as unstable rather than confront the message. That tension hangs over Ezekiel's ministry. Was he a mad exile performing disturbing acts beside foreign canals? Or a divinely commissioned watchman desperately trying to awaken a sleeping people? The narrative leaves no doubt where it stands. Ezekiel's bizarre signs are not evidence of meaningless chaos. They are the mercy of warning before irreversible judgment. Because when ordinary words no longer penetrate, sometimes the message must become impossible to look away from. At this point in Ezekiel's story, The audience has seen the visions, the strange symbolic acts, the unsettling warnings, and the relentless insistence that catastrophe is approaching. But a critical question still remains. Why? Why would Jerusalem, the city so deeply bound to Israel's covenant imagination, be allowed to fall at all? Why would the temple, the sacred center of worship, become vulnerable to destruction? Why would divine judgment fall so severely on the very people who believed themselves chosen? Because without answering that question, Ezekiel becomes little more than a prophet of doom. But Ezekiel is not presenting random disaster. He is constructing a moral and theological indictment. In his worldview, Jerusalem is not falling because Babylon is simply stronger. It is falling because covenant collapse has already happened long before military collapse becomes visible. To understand this, we must enter the logic of ancient covenant theology. Israel's relationship with God was not imagined as unconditional national immunity regardless of behavior. The covenant framework embedded in biblical tradition included blessings for faithfulness and warnings for rebellion. Land, security, prosperity, and divine presence were not magical guarantees detached from ethical responsibility. They were relational realities tied to covenant loyalty. This is why Ezekiel's accusations are so severe. He is not condemning isolated moral failures. He is describing systemic betrayal. One of Ezekiel's most repeated charges is idolatry. To modern secular ears, idolatry can sound abstract, like a merely religious technical offense. In Ezekiel's context, it was far more serious. Worship in the ancient world was inseparable from political allegiance, moral identity, social structure, and cultural worldview. To worship other gods was not simply to diversify spiritual preferences. It was covenant treason. The people who had been called into exclusive relationship with Yahweh had repeatedly embraced rival forms of devotion, high places, images, ritual practices linked to surrounding cultures, syncretism, spiritual compromise. Ezekiel's language is often intentionally shocking, using marital betrayal imagery to communicate the emotional and covenantal seriousness of this unfaithfulness. But idolatry is only part of the indictment. Ezekiel also condemns violence, corruption, exploitation, injustice, and moral decay. This is crucial. Biblical prophetic critique is not narrowly ritualistic. The issue is not merely incorrect worship forms, while everyday ethics remain irrelevant. Worship and justice are inseparable. A society can maintain religious appearance while rotting morally underneath. Ezekiel accuses leaders, princes, priests, prophets, and ordinary people alike. Bloodshed fills the land. Power is abused. The vulnerable are exploited. Truth is distorted. Religious office does not exempt anyone. In fact, leadership often receives harsher scrutiny because leadership magnifies consequences. This broad moral indictment aligns Ezekiel with wider prophetic tradition. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Amos, Micah, and others repeatedly insisted that covenant faithfulness includes social ethics, not merely ceremonial correctness. Yet Ezekiel adds his own distinctive intensity. His descriptions are often graphic, emotionally charged, deliberately unsettling. He wants his audience to feel the ugliness of what has been normalized. Another dangerous illusion Ezekiel attacks is false security in sacred institutions. This may be one of his most psychologically important themes. Many in Judah likely believed Jerusalem was ultimately untouchable because of the temple. The existence of the sacred center itself became a form of theological insurance. God's house was here. Therefore, catastrophe could not go too far. This assumption had historical roots. Jerusalem had survived previous threats. Sacred memory reinforced confidence. But Ezekiel's theology is merciless toward institutional complacency. Sacred symbols cannot protect a people determined to violate the covenant they symbolize. Presence without faithfulness becomes hollow security. This is one of the most devastating prophetic reversals in Scripture. The very institution meant to signify divine relationship becomes incapable of shielding rebellion. Politically, Judah's behavior also reflected disastrous judgment. Leadership repeatedly navigated international crises through unstable alliances, rebellion, and denial of geopolitical reality. Babylon was not an abstract threat. It was an expanding imperial machine. Yet political calculations often seemed fueled by wishful thinking, perhaps including hopes of Egyptian support. Ezekiel does not reduce everything to politics, but neither does he ignore political responsibility. Human decisions matter. Strategic foolishness has consequences. Theologically, however, Ezekiel sees deeper causation beneath visible events. Babylon is an instrument, not ultimate explanation. This perspective radically reframes history. Defeat is not proof that Yahweh is weak. Defeat is proof that Yahweh is judging. That distinction changes everything. One of Ezekiel's most difficult themes for modern readers is collective accountability. Contemporary Western frameworks often prioritize individual moral responsibility almost exclusively. Ezekiel certainly affirms personal accountability, especially later in the book. But he also operates within a world where communities, institutions, and nations can accumulate collective corruption. Social systems can become morally diseased. Leadership decisions can implicate populations. Cultural normalization can distort conscience. This does not erase individual nuance, but it explains why prophetic judgment language often addresses the nation as a whole. Ezekiel's critique also includes false prophecy. This is enormously significant. Not every religious voice speaking confidence represented truth. Some prophets proclaimed peace where no peace existed. Optimistic spiritual messaging can be psychologically attractive, especially during crisis. People prefer reassurance over confrontation, but Ezekiel treats comforting deception as spiritually lethal. A false sense of security delays repentance. It anesthetizes urgency. It turns impending catastrophe into background noise. This dynamic feels disturbingly familiar across eras. Religious messaging that confirms existing desires is often easier to embrace than warnings demanding transformation. Ezekiel also confronts inherited theological misunderstandings. Some may have assumed covenant election guaranteed immunity regardless of conduct. Others perhaps believed ancestral legacy would protect them. Ezekiel dismantles these assumptions. Sacred history is not a substitute for present faithfulness. The fact that God acted in the past does not mean present rebellion carries no consequences. This makes Ezekiel's message terrifying because it removes comforting loopholes. Temple status will not save them. National identity will not save them. Historical memory will not save them. Religious symbolism will not save them. The problem is not Babylon outside the walls. The problem is corruption inside them. Yet Ezekiel's indictment is not emotional rage detached from theological coherence. It follows a structured moral logic. Covenant relationship implies covenant responsibility. Persistent rebellion triggers covenant consequence. Divine patience does not mean permanent tolerance. Judgment is not arbitrary cruelty. It is presented as the culmination of repeated, ignored warnings. This does not remove all modern ethical discomfort. Ezekiel's language is intense, and some imagery remains deeply challenging. But within the book's own theological framework, the argument is internally coherent. Jerusalem falls not because divine promises failed, but because covenant rebellion reached its breaking point. And still, perhaps the most tragic dimension is this. Much of the audience likely could not see themselves this way. People living inside moral decline rarely narrate themselves as villains. Corruption often feels normal from within. Religious compromise can appear pragmatic. Political denial can masquerade as hope. Institutional loyalty can hide spiritual emptiness. Ezekiel's role is to tear away those illusions, to force recognition. to declare that what looks like random disaster is in fact moral reckoning. This is why Jerusalem had to fall in Ezekiel's theology. Not because God abandoned justice, but because justice had finally arrived. And what makes that conclusion so devastating is that the people most certain of divine protection were the very ones least prepared for what was coming next. If Ezekiel's earlier vision shattered the illusion that God was absent from Babylon, the next revelation destroys an even deeper assumption, that Jerusalem's temple remained spiritually pure simply because it still stood. For many in Ezekiel's world, the temple was not merely a religious building. It was the symbolic center of covenant identity, the earthly focal point of divine presence, the place where heaven and Israel's national story seems to intersect. To question its sanctity was to question the emotional architecture of an entire civilization. And that is exactly what Ezekiel's next vision does. In the 6th year of exile, while sitting among the elders in his house, Ezekiel describes a dramatic visionary encounter. The hand of the Lord falls upon him. He sees a figure with fiery brilliance, and then in visionary transport he is lifted between earth and heaven and brought to Jerusalem. Whether one interprets this as literal supernatural transport, ecstatic visionary experience, or symbolic prophetic revelation, the narrative purpose is unmistakable. Ezekiel is being shown what ordinary sight cannot reveal. Not the public face of Jerusalem, but its hidden spiritual condition. The destination is devastatingly specific, the temple complex itself. This matters enormously. Ezekiel is not shown corruption in some distant pagan shrine. He is taken to the sacred center of Judah's worship. The indictment begins at the place most associated with holiness. There, at the entrance of the inner gate facing north, he sees what the text calls an image provoking jealousy. The exact nature of this image remains debated. Scholars propose different possibilities. Perhaps a cultic object linked to idolatrous worship, perhaps an Asherah-related symbol, perhaps a broader symbolic representation of rival devotion. The precise identification matters less than the theological point. Something incompatible with exclusive covenant worship has been placed within sacred space itself. This is not peripheral contamination. This is internal corruption. The symbolism is explosive. The place meant to embody fidelity has become compromised from within. Yet the vision descends even deeper. Ezekiel is instructed to look beyond the visible surface. He is shown a wall, then told to dig through it. Behind the wall lies a hidden chamber. What he sees there is profoundly disturbing. Creeping things, detestable animals, and images, with 70 elders of Israel standing before them, offering incense. This is elite religious corruption, leadership participating in concealed idolatry. The hidden setting matters. Public religion and private reality diverge. Outward legitimacy masks internal compromise. One elder is specifically named, Jazaniah, son of Shaphan, a detail that gives narrative concreteness and perhaps intensifies the tragedy, given associations with earlier reformist circles, depending on interpretive context. The elders say, "The Lord does not see us. The Lord has forsaken the land." That statement is psychologically revealing. Their behavior is not merely opportunistic syncretism. It reflects theological despair or rationalization. If God is absent, alternative spiritual strategies become justifiable. This is one of the most dangerous dynamics in religious collapse. Corruption often begins not with overt rebellion, but with internal reinterpretation of reality. If divine oversight feels distant, hidden compromise becomes easier to rationalize. But the vision is not finished. Ezekiel is then shown women weeping for Tammuz. This reference opens a window into broader ancient Near Eastern religious practice. Tammuz, associated in Mesopotamian tradition with seasonal death and renewal motifs, was connected to lament rituals. The exact historical manifestation in Jerusalem remains debated, but the symbolism is clear. Foreign cultic practices have penetrated sacred space. Emotional ritual energy is being directed toward non-covenant devotion. Again, this is not occurring in distant pagan territory. It is happening within the orbit of the temple. Yet even this is described as not the worst thing. The final scene is perhaps the most shocking. Ezekiel sees about 25 men in the inner court between the porch and the altar, turning their backs to the temple and bowing toward the east, worshiping the sun. The imagery is devastatingly intentional. They are physically positioned within sacred space while symbolically reversing covenant orientation. Their backs are toward the temple. Their worship is directed elsewhere. This is not accidental compromise. It is enacted rejection. Solar worship had broader ancient precedents, but within Ezekiel's theological framework, the point is not comparative religion analysis. The point is covenant betrayal at the heart of sacred worship. The cumulative effect of the vision is overwhelming. Corruption at multiple levels, public symbols of idolatry, secret leadership compromise, ritual mourning linked to foreign cultic patterns, direct cosmic worship in defiance of covenant identity. Ezekiel is constructing a theological autopsy of Jerusalem's spiritual condition. And critically, this explains what earlier warnings alone could not fully justify. The problem is not simply political incompetence or isolated moral failure. The corruption has reached the sanctuary itself. Modern readers naturally ask historical questions. Did these events literally occur exactly as described? Is this symbolic visionary indictment rather than journalistic reporting? How historically widespread were these practices? Scholarly interpretations vary. Some emphasize the prophetic vision's symbolic theological function rather than strict documentary reconstruction. Others argue the broader historical plausibility of syncretistic religious practices in late monarchic Judah makes the imagery entirely credible. What matters for the narrative is that Ezekiel's audience is confronted with a devastating theological claim. The temple's visible existence does not guarantee spiritual integrity. Sacred architecture can coexist with profound corruption. That message extends far beyond ancient Jerusalem. Another striking feature is the progressive unveiling. Ezekiel is repeatedly told, "You will see even greater abominations." This narrative structure creates escalating horror. Surface corruption leads to hidden corruption, which leads to deeper betrayal. Then finally, overt inversion of covenant worship. The revelation works like descending through layers of denial. Each step strips away another illusion. This also intensifies the emotional impact on Ezekiel himself. Remember who he is, a priest by lineage, a man whose identity was shaped around the sanctity of temple worship. He is not a detached critic attacking institutions he never loved. He is witnessing the desecration of the very center of his inherited sacred world. The vision is not emotionally abstract, it is profoundly personal. There is also an important theological tension here. Earlier exile communities may have interpreted their displacement as evidence that Babylon's power overwhelmed Judah. Ezekiel's vision reframes that assumption entirely. Jerusalem's problem is not divine weakness. It is internal corruption so severe that judgment becomes morally intelligible within covenant logic. This is not Babylon defeating God. This is a sanctuary becoming unrecognizable from within. Perhaps the most unsettling lesson is how hidden corruption operates. None of these scenes emphasize public self-awareness. The participants do not appear to narrate themselves as destroyers of sacred identity. Religious compromise often feels reasonable from inside the system. Private rationalizations become normalized. Institutional prestige masks spiritual decay. Ritual continuity creates false reassurance. Ezekiel's vision exists precisely to expose what ordinary perception misses. Because from the outside, Jerusalem still had walls, priests, rituals, sacred architecture, and covenant language. But from the divine perspective Ezekiel is being shown, the center has already been hollowed out. And once that truth is revealed, the next terrifying question becomes unavoidable. If the temple itself has been corrupted, what happens to the divine presence that once made it holy? If the previous vision exposed corruption inside the temple, this chapter reveals something even more devastating. Corruption alone is horrifying, but sacred corruption carries an even darker implication. What happens when the divine presence that made a place holy no longer remains there? For ancient Judah, this question was almost unthinkable. The temple was not merely a national monument or ceremonial structure. It was the symbolic center of the covenant world, the place where sacrifice, priesthood, sacred law, national identity, and divine presence converged. If Jerusalem represented political identity, the temple represented cosmic meaning. To imagine God abandoning it was not simply emotionally painful, it was a theological earthquake. And Ezekiel now witnesses exactly that. The vision does not depict an instant dramatic exit. That is what makes it so haunting. The departure of divine glory unfolds in stages, deliberate, almost judicial, as if each movement marks another irreversible threshold. The God Ezekiel encountered earlier on the mobile throne in Babylon is now shown in relation to Jerusalem's sanctuary, but not as a permanently fixed resident trapped within sacred architecture. That distinction is everything. The first movement begins with judgment. Ezekiel sees executioners, terrifying agents of destruction, summoned against the city. Among them is one clothed in linen carrying writing equipment, a detail suggesting distinction, purpose, record-keeping, perhaps judicial marking. Before destruction falls, a command is given. Mark those who grieve over the abominations committed in the city. This moment matters profoundly. Judgment is not depicted as indiscriminate chaos. Moral discernment remains active. Those who mourn corruption are symbolically distinguished from those who participate or remain hardened. Interpretations differ regarding the exact theological implications, but narratively, the point is clear. The city's fate is not random imperial violence. It unfolds under divine moral scrutiny. Then comes the terrifying instruction. Judgment begins at the sanctuary. This reverses every comforting assumption. Surely the sacred center would be the safest place. Surely proximity to holiness would protect. Instead, accountability intensifies closest to the sacred. Those entrusted with spiritual responsibility are not shielded by office. In fact, nearness to holiness increases the severity of failure. This principle runs throughout prophetic theology and remains psychologically disturbing because institutions often assume sacred status creates immunity. Ezekiel says the temple courts become filled with the slain. The imagery is intentionally shocking. Sacred space has become a place of judgment. But the emotional center of this chapter is not merely destruction, it is departure. The glory of the Lord, the same overwhelming divine presence associated with Ezekiel's earlier throne vision, begins to move. To grasp the force of this, we must understand what divine glory represented in Israel's imagination. Biblical traditions associated the divine presence with dramatic manifestations: cloud, fire, radiance, overwhelming holiness. Later theological language would speak of Shekinah, though that specific terminology develops in later Jewish tradition. The essential idea, however, is clear. God's presence was not an abstract philosophical concept. It was the defining reality that made the temple meaningful. Without it, the structure was only architecture. Ezekiel watches as the glory moves from its place above the cherubim toward the threshold of the temple. This movement may sound subtle to modern readers, but symbolically, it is devastating. The center is shifting. Something is changing. The divine presence is no longer simply enthroned as stable occupant. It is in motion. The cherubim imagery recalls the throne vision, linking Jerusalem's sanctuary to the larger cosmic sovereignty Ezekiel already encountered. God was never merely a local deity attached to one building. Now that theological truth becomes emotionally catastrophic. The same mobility that meant divine presence could reach Babylon also means divine presence can depart Jerusalem. Mobility brings both hope and judgment. The vision intensifies, the cherubim rise, wheels appear, echoing the earlier throne imagery with terrifying consistency. The mobile throne mechanism is active again, but now in the context of withdrawal. The glory moves further toward the east gate of the Lord's house. Every stage matters. The departure is narrated with solemn deliberateness, almost like a royal exit. This is not sudden abandonment in emotional rage, it is judicial withdrawal. The symbolism is unbearable. God is leaving the city spiritually before Babylon destroys it physically. This reframes the entire catastrophe. Military defeat will not be the cause of divine absence. Divine withdrawal precedes visible collapse. That is a radically different theological interpretation of history. For Ezekiel's audience, this would have been almost impossible to process. Many still believe the temple guaranteed security. The presence of sacred structures reinforced that confidence. But Ezekiel's vision dismantles the illusion from within. A building cannot preserve covenant relationship if the covenant itself has been betrayed. Divine presence is not mechanically controlled by human institutions. This is one of the most profound theological claims in the entire book. Sacred space matters, but it is not magical. Covenant faithfulness matters more. There is another emotionally devastating dimension. Remember Ezekiel's identity. He is a priest by lineage, a man whose life should have revolved around temple service. Watching the glory depart is not merely receiving abstract doctrine. It is witnessing the collapse of his inherited sacred universe. Everything his priestly imagination associated with holiness is being transformed before him. This is grief at the level of worldview. Scholars often note the structured nature of the departure narrative. The glory moves incrementally from inner sanctuary toward threshold, then gate, then beyond. This staged movement may communicate restraint, warning, deliberation, or theological gravity. It emphasizes that judgment is not impulsive chaos. It unfolds with solemn intentionality. Some interpreters also see mercy embedded in the gradual nature of the departure, as if the narrative leaves space for recognition, though the text does not explicitly frame it that way. Another striking aspect is what this vision says about divine transcendence. Ancient religions often tied deities closely to territory, temples, or national geography. Defeat could imply divine defeat. Ezekiel rejects that framework completely. God is not expelled by Babylonian power. God chooses to withdraw. That distinction preserves divine sovereignty while explaining national catastrophe. Babylon is not stronger than Yahweh. Yahweh is acting in judgment. Yet this theological logic creates emotional terror. If God has chosen to leave, what remains? Walls without protection, ritual without presence, architecture without holiness, identity without its center. This is more than military vulnerability. It is existential collapse. And still, within the terror lies a paradoxical thread of hope. The very fact that divine presence is mobile means sacred geography no longer exclusively defines encounter. The same God who departs Jerusalem has already appeared in Babylon. That truth is not emotionally comforting yet, but it will become crucial later. For now, however, the dominant emotional reality is loss. The temple still stands physically in Ezekiel's time, but spiritually something irreversible has happened. The departure of glory means the catastrophe to come is no longer merely possible. It is theologically inevitable. This may be one of the most tragic moments in biblical literature, not because enemies invade, but because holiness withdraws. Not because walls fall, but because the presence that gave those walls meaning moves away. And once that happens, The next question becomes terrifyingly simple. If God has left the temple, what will happen to the city that believed it could never be abandoned? By the time we reach this moment in Ezekiel's story, the prophet has already endured exile, visionary terror, public humiliation, spiritual burden, and the crushing responsibility of announcing judgment to people who largely refused to listen. But nothing in his prophetic calling feels as personally devastating as what happens next. Because until now, Ezekiel's suffering has been symbolic, public, theological, and vocational. This time, the cost becomes intimate, private, irreplaceable. One of the most haunting passages in the entire book of Ezekiel begins with words almost unbearable in their emotional precision. The word of the Lord comes to Ezekiel and says that the desire of his eyes will be taken away with a single blow. The phrase is devastating. Not merely his wife, the desire of his eyes. The one he loves, the person whose presence gives emotional shape to ordinary life. In prophetic literature, language can often feel formal, but here the humanity is unmistakable. Ezekiel is not simply a messenger, he is a husband, and he is being told that by evening his wife will be dead. Then comes the command that makes this passage so deeply unsettling. He is told not to mourn publicly in the expected ways. No ritual lament, no visible performance of conventional grief. No public tears according to customary mourning patterns. He is instructed to sigh silently, to continue outwardly restrained. The next sentence is brutally simple. So I spoke to the people in the morning, and in the evening my wife died. There is almost no narrative decoration, no emotional monologue, no dramatic literary cushioning, just stark inevitability. The restraint makes it more devastating. The silence itself becomes part of the trauma. Modern readers often recoil here, and understandably so. Ethical discomfort is unavoidable. Why would such personal loss become part of prophetic symbolism? Is this divine cruelty? Literary theology, symbolic narrative construction, or something else entirely? Faith traditions and scholarly interpretations differ sharply, but what cannot be denied is the emotional weight of the passage. This is among the most difficult texts in prophetic literature, precisely because it brings theological symbolism into collision with intimate human suffering. To understand its function in Ezekiel's narrative, we must first understand the symbolic logic being presented. The people ask Ezekiel what his strange behavior means. Why this silence? Why this abnormal restraint? His answer is devastating. Just as he has lost the delight of his eyes, so Jerusalem will lose the temple, described with similar emotional language. The delight of your eyes, the object of your affection, the center of longing. The analogy is painful and deliberate. Personal bereavement becomes prophetic sign. The loss of Ezekiel's wife mirrors the coming loss of Jerusalem's sacred center. And the people, overwhelmed by catastrophe, will be too stunned even for normal mourning. This is not merely about death. It is about shock so profound that ordinary emotional frameworks collapse. Yet, to stop its symbolic function would be to miss the human dimension entirely. Ezekiel's wife remains unnamed in the text. That absence has often troubled readers. But unnamed does not mean insignificant. The emotional language proves otherwise. She matters deeply. The text offers no biography, no dialogue, no narrative development of their relationship, which, paradoxically, intensifies the tragedy. We are given just enough to feel the emotional reality, and then forced to sit with silence. In documentary terms, this restraint is psychologically powerful. Real trauma often arrives without narrative explanation. One day, ordinary life exists. By evening, everything is changed. Scholars approach this passage through multiple interpretive lenses. Some read it as historical autobiographical report embedded in prophetic narrative. Others explore literary theological function, emphasizing symbolic construction rather than recoverable historical detail. Some wrestle with the ethics of prophetic suffering in biblical literature more broadly. None of these approaches fully remove the emotional challenge, because the text is intentionally difficult. It is meant to disturb. Ezekiel's ministry repeatedly insists that divine judgment is not abstract. Here, that principle becomes painfully embodied. Theologically, this passage also reinforces a recurring pattern in prophetic literature. The messenger participates in the message. Ezekiel does not merely announce catastrophe from emotional distance. He experiences symbolic loss personally. This gives his warnings disturbing authenticity. He knows something about grief. Before he tells others, grief is coming. Yet authenticity does not erase anguish. Another important layer involves mourning customs in the ancient Near East. Public lamentation was culturally expected. Mourning rituals were structured, communal, embodied. Silence in the face of devastating loss would itself be startling behavior. Ezekiel's restraint, therefore, becomes visible prophetic communication. The abnormal response is part of the sign. The audience notices precisely because grief normally demands expression. But beneath symbolic communication lies a profound psychological question. What does this reveal about Ezekiel himself? Throughout the book, Ezekiel can appear overwhelming, severe, saturated with judgment imagery and symbolic performance. This passage reminds us he is not merely prophetic machinery. He is emotionally vulnerable, capable of love, capable of devastating loss. The simplicity of the narrative may actually intensify this humanity rather than diminish it. There is no theatrical emotional speech because trauma often exceeds language. The silence tells its own story. This chapter also marks a transition in Ezekiel's ministry. His prophetic message about Jerusalem is moving toward confirmation. The personal sign anticipates collective catastrophe. The destruction of the temple will not be interpreted merely as political defeat. It will be experienced as intimate bereavement. The analogy is carefully chosen because sacred architecture was not emotionally neutral for the people. The temple was identity, memory, covenant symbolism, national hope. Losing it would feel like losing the center of emotional reality itself. Ezekiel's personal tragedy becomes interpretive preparation for communal trauma. Some readers have asked whether the text implies emotional suppression as a spiritual ideal. That would likely misread the narrative. The point is not universal instruction about healthy grief. This is a specific prophetic sign act in a unique theological context. Elsewhere, biblical literature contains abundant lament, tears, mourning, protest, and emotional expression. Ezekiel's silence is exceptional symbolic obedience, not general emotional doctrine. Still, the ethical discomfort remains, and perhaps it should. Some biblical texts are meant to be wrestled with rather than neatly resolved. The emotional power of this passage lies partly in its refusal to offer easy closure. What is perhaps most haunting is the narrative compression. Morning, he speaks. Evening, she dies. The next day, he acts as commanded. The speed mirrors real catastrophe. Life can fracture in a single day. No preparation fully protects the human heart. And for Ezekiel, this loss occurs within a larger story already saturated with judgment, exile, and emotional strain. The burden is cumulative. Yet even here, Ezekiel continues in the role of watchman. That continuity is psychologically staggering. Grief does not suspend the mission. The message continues. Whether one interprets this as heroic obedience, tragic burden, or something more ambiguous, the cost is undeniable. By now, Ezekiel's prophetic identity has demanded almost everything: home, vocation, social normalcy, emotional stability, and now, intimate companionship. The prophet who warned of national loss now tastes devastating personal loss himself. And in doing so, he becomes not only the messenger of judgment, but its embodied witness. For years, Ezekiel had been the man nobody wanted to be right. He had warned that Jerusalem's confidence was misplaced. He had enacted bizarre prophetic signs, declared judgment, exposed hidden corruption, described the departure of divine glory, and even embodied personal loss as a sign of the catastrophe to come. But prophecy, no matter how dramatic, still leaves room for denial until history catches up. As long as Jerusalem still stood, hope could survive. Political reversals happen. Sieges can fail. Alliances can shift. Religious optimism can reinterpret warnings. But then the message arrives, and with it, everything changes. The book of Ezekiel records the moment with striking precision. In the 12th year of exile, in the 10th month, on the 5th day, a fugitive arrives from Jerusalem with a simple announcement. The city has fallen. That sentence may be among the heaviest in the entire narrative. Not because the audience did not know catastrophe was possible, but because possibility has now become irreversible fact. The city still existed in memory, imagination, hope, and denial. Now it exists as ruin. To understand the emotional force of this moment, we must appreciate the timeline. Ezekiel had been deported in the earlier Babylonian exile of 597 BCE, when Jerusalem was humiliated but not yet destroyed. A puppet king remained. The temple still stood. Many exiles likely believed restoration could come quickly. Some perhaps saw themselves as temporarily displaced elites waiting for political reversal. That illusion sustained emotional survival, but it also delayed reckoning. Ezekiel's warnings directly attacked that false hope. He insisted the deeper judgment was still coming. Now, years later, a survivor physically arrives carrying confirmation that the unimaginable has happened. Jerusalem has fallen. Historically, the destruction of Jerusalem by Babylon in 586 BCE was one of the defining catastrophes in Jewish history. The city was besieged. Famine intensified, defenses collapsed, leadership fractured, the temple was destroyed. Royal power effectively ended, deportations expanded. The psychological impact cannot be overstated. Ancient peoples tied identity deeply to land, dynasty, sacred architecture, and collective memory. This was not merely military defeat, it was civilizational trauma. But for Ezekiel's audience, the emotional complexity was even sharper. Because many were already exiles. They had spent years suspended between displacement and hope. Their homeland existed at a distance, wounded but still symbolically alive. As long as Jerusalem stood, identity remained tethered to a surviving center. Once it fell, exile changed meaning entirely. Temporary displacement became something darker. The world they knew was truly gone. There is another profound detail in Ezekiel's narrative. The prophet's speech constraint, previously imposed as part of his symbolic calling, changes at this moment. When the fugitive arrives, Ezekiel's mouth is opened. This is narratively significant. His long warning ministry has reached validation. The period of constrained prophetic silence transitions into a new phase. The watchman who warned of judgment now speaks into confirmed catastrophe. The structure is deliberate. History has authenticated the warning. But vindication is not triumph. That distinction matters. Ezekiel being proven right does not create celebration. There is no victory in being correct about national ruin. If anything, the confirmation deepens tragedy. The destruction of Jerusalem means the loss of the temple, the collapse of political identity, expanded suffering for survivors, and the death of cherished assumptions. The prophet's credibility is established through collective disaster. That is not vindication anyone would desire. Psychologically, this is the collapse of denial. Human beings can sustain extraordinary emotional tension when outcomes remain uncertain. Hope, even fragile hope, helps preserve coherence. But when uncertainty ends in confirmed catastrophe, emotional defenses often collapse. Shock replaces speculation. Grief replaces argument. Silence replaces denial. Ezekiel's earlier symbolic actions about stunned mourning now become understandable. The people had imagined judgment abstractly. Now it is personal, concrete, historical, final. This moment also resolves one of the central theological tensions of the book. Was Babylon stronger than Yahweh? Had divine promises failed? Were Ezekiel's visions merely trauma-induced warnings disconnected from reality? The fall of Jerusalem does not automatically answer every theological question. But within Ezekiel's narrative framework, it confirms his interpretation. The catastrophe was not random geopolitical misfortune. It unfolded as prophetic judgment long anticipated. That internal narrative coherence is crucial. Yet something equally important happens here. The destruction of Jerusalem does not end Ezekiel's mission. It transforms it. Up until now, much of his ministry has been dominated by warning, indictment, exposure, and impending doom. Once the catastrophe is confirmed, the emotional and theological needs of the community shift. A people living in denial require confrontation. A people living in confirmed devastation require something else. Not false optimism, but the possibility of meaning beyond collapse. This chapter is the hinge between judgment and restoration. The narrative arc pivots here. Before this moment, Ezekiel's audience could still imagine the preservation of the old world. After this moment, that world is gone. Any future hope must be built on radically different foundations, not denial, not temple invincibility, not political fantasy. Something new must emerge. Historically, this transition is enormously important for Jewish theological development. The destruction of the temple forced deep questions. How does covenant identity survive without land, monarchy, or sanctuary? How can worship continue in exile? What does divine faithfulness mean after catastrophe? Ezekiel becomes one of the major voices helping shape those answers. But emotionally, that future is not visible yet. First comes grief. We should not underestimate the symbolic magnitude of Jerusalem's fall. Cities in the ancient world were not interchangeable administrative centers. Jerusalem carried theological density, Davidic memory, temple sacrifice, national festivals, pilgrimage identity, covenant imagination. Its destruction felt like the collapse of sacred geography itself. The center was gone. For Ezekiel personally, the emotional complexity is profound. Remember his identity: a priest without a temple, a prophet of judgment, a husband who had already embodied personal bereavement, a watchman burdened with warning. Now the catastrophe he foresaw is historically confirmed. This is not abstract fulfillment. It is the destruction of the sacred world he himself once expected to serve. The prophet is not emotionally outside the tragedy he interprets. Scholars often note how carefully Ezekiel's chronology is structured, reinforcing historical seriousness and theological narrative design. The arrival of the fugitive is not vague rumor. It is anchored in remembered time. That precision matters because the event is civilizationally defining. There is also something deeply human about delayed news in the ancient world. No instant communication, no live battlefield updates. Communities waited in uncertainty, dependent on survivors, rumor, fragments, and travelers. The emotional whiplash of waiting years only to receive catastrophic confirmation would have been immense. This was not a breaking news headline. It was the collapse of deferred hope arriving in human form. And yet, paradoxically, once the worst has happened, a strange new possibility emerges. Illusions are dead. False hopes are exhausted. Denial has no shelter left. And while that sounds purely bleak, it creates the first honest space in which real restoration can eventually be imagined. Because before dry bones can live, they must first be acknowledged as bones. Before a new temple can be envisioned, the old one must truly be gone. Before hope becomes meaningful, fantasy must die. Jerusalem has fallen, and for Ezekiel, that is not the end of the story. It is the brutal beginning of an entirely new one. Once Jerusalem has fallen, a profound theological question emerges from the ashes. If Judah has been judged, what about everyone else? If Babylon destroyed Jerusalem, does that mean the surrounding nations were vindicated? Were Israel's enemies simply the winners of history, free from moral scrutiny because they happened to stand on the victorious side of catastrophe? This is where Ezekiel's story expands dramatically. Up until now, the emotional center of the narrative has been internal: Judah's corruption, Jerusalem's collapse, covenant failure, sacred loss. But now the camera pulls outward. The prophet who spent so long indicting his own people begins speaking against the nations around them. And this shift matters deeply, because without it, Ezekiel's theology could easily sound like a narrow national tragedy. Instead, he insists on something much larger. The God who judged Jerusalem is not merely a tribal deity concerned only with one defeated people. He is sovereign over all nations, all powers, all empires, all histories. The oracles against foreign nations in Ezekiel are not random geopolitical commentary. They are theological declarations about justice beyond Israel. The sequence includes Ammon, Moab, Edom, Philistia, Tyre, Sidon, and Egypt, each carrying distinct symbolic significance in Israel's historical memory. Some were neighboring rivals with long histories of tension. Others represented economic power, political arrogance, or imperial influence. Together, they form a wider moral map of the ancient Near East. The first targets, Ammon, Moab, Edom, and Philistia, are not distant, abstract enemies. These are neighboring peoples with tangled historical relationships to Israel and Judah, marked by rivalry, kinship complexity, territorial conflict, and accumulated resentment. Ezekiel's accusations often center not merely on opposition, but on reaction. Rejoicing over Judah's downfall, mockery, opportunism, exploiting catastrophe. This is psychologically revealing. One of the ugliest human instincts is celebrating another people's collapse, especially when historical grievance makes their suffering feel deserved. Ezekiel's message is that such responses are themselves morally indictable. The fall of Jerusalem does not grant ethical immunity to those who gloat over it. Edom in particular carries emotional intensity and biblical tradition. Shared ancestry narratives make hostility especially painful. Betrayal from enemies is expected. Betrayal from kin feels different. Ezekiel's treatment reflects that emotional complexity. But perhaps the most dramatic foreign oracle concerns Tyre. Tyre was no ordinary neighboring state. It was a wealthy Phoenician maritime power, commercially sophisticated, internationally connected, economically dazzling by ancient standards. If Jerusalem represented sacred identity, Tyre represented mercantile success. Ezekiel's lament over Tyre is among the most literarily rich passages in prophetic literature, describing ships, trade networks, luxury goods, and spectacular collapse. The message is clear. Economic brilliance does not create invincibility. Wealth can foster illusion. Power can disguise fragility. The imagery is deliberately grand because Tyre's self-perception was grand. Some passages even use language so elevated that later readers debated symbolic layers beyond immediate historical referent. But within Ezekiel's narrative context, the essential theme remains judgment against pride. Tyre believed itself secure. History disagreed. Then there is Egypt, the ancient superpower whose symbolic significance stretches far beyond immediate politics. Egypt represented history, memory, imperial scale, and, in Judah's case, dangerous political temptation. Again and again, smaller Levantine states looked toward Egypt as possible counterweight against Mesopotamian domination. False geopolitical hope often ran southward. Ezekiel's oracles against Egypt dismantle that illusion. Egypt is portrayed with overwhelming symbolic imagery, including the great monster of the Nile, prideful self-exaltation, and inevitable humiliation. This matters because Judah's political imagination had often treated Egypt as potential salvation. Ezekiel insists that misplaced trust in imperial alternatives is spiritually foolish. One collapsing empire cannot save you from deeper covenant realities. Babylon may be the instrument of present judgment, but Babylon is not the moral center of the universe, nor is Egypt the solution. Theologically, these nation oracles serve several critical functions. First, they prevent despairing nationalism from concluding that Judah alone was subject to divine scrutiny, while the rest of the world operated beyond moral accountability. That would make history feel arbitrary. Ezekiel rejects that. Divine justice extends outward. Second, they prevent defeated exiles from assuming foreign success equals moral righteousness. Military victory does not automatically indicate ethical superiority. Third, they expand the scope of Yahweh's sovereignty. The God of Ezekiel is not geographically trapped, not ethnically confined, not politically provincial. This connects directly to the opening throne vision. The mobile, divine presence seen in Babylon was already hinting at universal sovereignty. These nation oracles make that claim explicit. Scholars often compare Ezekiel's foreign nation oracles with broader prophetic traditions. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Amos, and others also include international judgment materials. This reflects a common biblical conviction that history itself exists under divine moral evaluation. Yet Ezekiel's style remains distinct, highly symbolic, emotionally intense, architecturally structured, often visually overwhelming. The rhetoric is designed not merely to inform, but to destabilize assumptions about power. There is also an important emotional dimension for the exile audience. Imagine being a displaced, defeated community, hearing judgment pronounced not only on yourself, but on surrounding powers. This would not erase suffering, but it would radically reshape emotional interpretation. Catastrophe had not removed divine justice from the world. The moral universe had not collapsed simply because Jerusalem had. That distinction matters psychologically. Trauma often creates the illusion that chaos rules everything. Ezekiel insists history still has moral structure, even when painful. At the same time, modern readers should resist simplistic triumphal readings. These texts are not invitations to nationalist revenge fantasy. Their function is theological, not emotional score settling. The message is not that suffering people should indulge fantasies of enemy destruction for comfort. The message is that divine justice cannot be reduced to immediate appearances. Power, wealth, empire, and mockery do not exempt anyone from accountability. Another striking feature is how these oracles repeatedly target pride, national arrogance, economic self-sufficiency, political self-deification, strategic overconfidence. The critique feels remarkably transhistorical. Civilizations often assume permanence when temporarily successful. Ezekiel's worldview relentlessly challenges that assumption. No nation is ultimate. No empire is eternal. No system escapes evaluation. For the broader narrative, this chapter serves as an essential bridge. Ezekiel has moved beyond internal covenant judgment into global moral vision. But this is not the final destination. The point is not endless condemnation. Something deeper is being prepared. Once divine sovereignty is established beyond Jerusalem, the possibility of restoration becomes conceptually larger as well. If God governs not merely one city's fate, but the fate of nations, then exile itself is not beyond redemption. The scale of sovereignty becomes the scale of hope. Yet emotionally, the audience is not there quite yet. They are still processing devastation, still recalibrating worldview, still learning that the collapse of their city did not mean the collapse of divine rule. Jerusalem fell, but history did not become morally empty. The nations, too, stand under scrutiny, and once that truth is established, Ezekiel can begin asking the question his shattered audience needs most. If judgment reaches everyone, is restoration still possible for anyone? After chapters saturated with judgment, collapse, exile, and shattered assumptions, Ezekiel reaches the vision that would become his most famous and perhaps most emotionally powerful revelation. If earlier scenes confronted corruption and catastrophe, this one confronts something even more final: death itself. Not symbolic inconvenience, not political setback, not temporary defeat. Death in its most irreversible visual form. Because Ezekiel is not brought to a wounded battlefield with survivors still breathing. He is brought to a valley filled with bones. Dry bones. That detail matters. These are not recent casualties, not bodies awaiting burial, not people hovering near rescue. Dryness communicates time, abandonment, total desolation, decomposition, finality. Whatever life once existed here is long gone. And that is exactly why this vision matters. It begins with movement. The hand of the Lord comes upon Ezekiel, and in visionary experience he is carried out by the Spirit and set down in the middle of a valley. Everywhere he looks, bones. Not a few scattered remains, but overwhelming abundance. He is made to walk among them. That narrative choice is psychologically brilliant. He is not shown the scene from safe distance. He must move through it. Observe it closely. Confront the scale of death directly. Then comes the devastating observation. They were very many and very dry. The repetition intensifies the hopelessness. Quantity and condition. Massive loss. Absolute lifelessness. Then the question comes, Son of man, can these bones live? It may be one of the most important questions in all prophetic literature. On one level, the obvious answer appears to be no. Biology says no. Time says no. Common sense says no. These are not injured people needing treatment. They are remains. Finality made visible. But Ezekiel does not answer with either optimism or despair. He says, Lord God, you know. This is not evasiveness. It is theological realism. Human assessment sees impossibility. Divine sovereignty remains an open category. Then comes the command, prophesy to the bones. Even now, Ezekiel's role remains consistent. He speaks because he is commanded, not because the situation looks promising. Imagine the absurdity from a purely natural perspective. Speaking words to dry bones in an empty valley. Yet prophecy in Ezekiel's world is not motivational rhetoric. It is participation in divine action. As he speaks, something begins to happen. Sound, rattling, movement, bones assembling, fragment to fragment, structure emerging from chaos, sinews appearing, flesh forming, skin covering what had been exposed remains. It is one of the most cinematic sequences in Scripture. But even then, something is still missing. Bodies are formed, but breath is absent. Structure without life, form without animation, restoration without vitality. So the command comes again, prophesy to the breath. Here the Hebrew word carries layered meaning, breath, wind, spirit. The theological richness is deliberate. Breath comes from the four winds, life enters, the bodies stand, an exceedingly great army. The transformation is total, from scattered dry remains to organized living multitude. But what does it mean? Popular interpretation often jumps immediately to individual resurrection themes, and certainly later theological traditions, including some strands of Jewish and Christian thought, found powerful resonance here. Yet Ezekiel himself provides the immediate interpretive key. These bones are the whole house of Israel. The people themselves speak the despairing diagnosis. Our bones are dried up, our hope is lost, we are cut off. This is exile psychology in its purest form, total hopelessness. Not wounded optimism, not delayed frustration. Complete existential exhaustion. The nation sees itself as dead. That is the emotional center of the vision. Historically, this makes perfect sense. Jerusalem destroyed, temple gone, monarchy ended, sacred geography lost, community fractured, identity destabilized. For exiles living in prolonged uncertainty and grief, national death was not metaphorical exaggeration. It felt psychologically real. Ezekiel's vision does not trivialize that despair. It begins by fully inhabiting it. The valley is not softened. The bones are genuinely dry. Hope is genuinely absent. Only then does transformation begin. The theological message is extraordinary. What human history has rendered impossible is not beyond divine action. But the restoration envisioned here is not initially framed as private spiritual encouragement detached from historical reality. It is corporate restoration, national renewal, return from exile, reconstitution of covenant identity. God promises to open graves symbolically and bring the people back. The language is dramatic because the situation demands dramatic hope. Scholars debate how literally resurrection language should be read in Ezekiel's original context. Some argue the passage functions primarily as metaphor for national restoration rather than developed individual resurrection doctrine. Others note that such imagery contributed significantly to later Jewish resurrection theology. Both observations can be true in different historical layers. What matters for Ezekiel's immediate audience is the message of impossible renewal after collective collapse. There is another profound theological layer here. Earlier in the book, divine breath and spirit have already played major roles. Ezekiel was empowered by the Spirit. The throne vision was animated by living movement. Now, breath becomes the difference between assembled structure and living reality. Restoration is not merely reconstruction. It requires divine animating presence. Institutions alone are not enough. Bodies alone are not enough. Form alone is not enough. Life comes through divine spirit. This echoes the broader biblical imagination, reaching back to creation itself, where breath animates dust into living humanity. Ezekiel's vision intentionally resonates with creation language. National restoration becomes a kind of re-creation. Emotionally, this chapter represents a profound turning point. For so long, Ezekiel has dismantled illusions, false hope, institutional complacency, political denial, sacred corruption. But true prophetic ministry cannot end in demolition alone. Once false hope dies, authentic hope becomes possible. Not shallow optimism pretending nothing happened, not denial disguised as faith, real hope that stares directly at death and still speaks of life. That distinction is crucial. Cheap hope would have told the exiles their problems were minor interruptions. Ezekiel offers something harder and deeper. Yes, the catastrophe was real. Yes, the nation feels dead. Yes, history has been devastating. And still, divine restoration remains conceivable. The army imagery is also striking. The restored community is not fragile debris. It stands organized, alive, formidable. This is not mere survival. It is transformation. Brokenness does not define the final chapter. Yet even here, caution matters. Ezekiel's vision is not a generic promise that every impossible human desire will be fulfilled. It emerges from specific covenant history, exile trauma, and prophetic theology. Modern readers often personalize it quickly, and while its emotional symbolism certainly resonates broadly, its original force is communal, historical, and theological. For the narrative of Ezekiel, this is the moment when despair begins to crack. The prophet who once announced destruction now announces life where no life appears possible. The watchman of judgment becomes the herald of restoration, and perhaps that is why this vision has endured across centuries, because every generation eventually encounters its own valley of dry bones. Moments when institutions fail, identities fracture, losses accumulate, and hope feels biologically impossible. Ezekiel does not deny the bones. He walks among them. He names them honestly. And then he dares to ask the question that changes everything. What if death is not the final word? If the valley of dry bones answered the question of whether a dead people could live again, the next vision confronts a different but equally painful question. Even if life returns, what exactly will be restored? Because survival alone is not the same as healing. A shattered people can remain alive and still deeply fractured. Trauma can preserve existence while destroying unity. And in Israel's case, the fracture ran far deeper than Babylonian exile. Long before Jerusalem fell, the nation itself had already been broken. To understand the emotional force of Ezekiel's next symbolic act, we must go back centuries before exile. After the reign of Solomon, the united monarchy fractured. Political tensions, taxation burdens, tribal loyalties, leadership failures, and competing visions of authority contributed to the split. The northern kingdom became Israel, often associated with Ephraim as its dominant tribal symbol. The southern kingdom remained Judah, centered on Jerusalem and the Davidic line. What had once imagined itself as a unified covenant people became divided political realities. That division shaped centuries of history, warfare, religious competition, competing sacred centers, shifting alliances, and accumulated memory. By Ezekiel's time, the northern kingdom had long since fallen to Assyria. The southern kingdom had now collapsed under Babylon. National fracture was not temporary dysfunction. It was historical identity. Which means restoration, if it were to come, required more than returning displaced individuals to land. It required healing ancient division itself. That is the context for Ezekiel's next symbolic act. The prophet is commanded to take 2 sticks. On one, he writes Judah and the people associated with him. On the other, Joseph, often linked with Ephraim and the northern house of Israel. Then comes the striking command. Join them into one stick, so they become one in his hand. Compared to Ezekiel's earlier dramatic sign acts, this may appear simple. No prolonged bodily suffering, no siege reenactment, no deprivation rituals. But symbolically, the act is profound. The visual message is immediate. What history tore apart may be brought together again. The people naturally ask what it means. That question matters because Ezekiel's symbolic acts are never empty theater. They invite interpretation. His explanation is explicit. God will take the divided peoples and make them one nation again in the land. No longer 2 kingdoms, no longer fractured political identities, no longer mutual alienation. Unity replaces division. For modern readers, it is easy to underestimate how radical this promise would have sounded. The split between North and South was not recent political inconvenience. It was generational reality. Entire populations had lived and died knowing only division. Historical grievances harden over time. Shared ancestry does not guarantee reconciliation. In fact, shared ancestry can intensify resentment. The deeper the relational history, the deeper the wounds. Ezekiel's vision is therefore not merely about territorial restoration, It is about relational healing across historical fracture. This makes it one of the most emotionally powerful restoration promises in the book. The Valley of Dry Bones addressed death. The two sticks address division. Both are forms of impossibility. Theologically, this also expands the meaning of restoration. Earlier hopes might have focused narrowly on Judah's survival or Jerusalem's rebuilding. Ezekiel's vision broadens the horizon. God's restorative purpose encompasses the whole covenant people, not merely surviving fragments of one political entity. This matters deeply because exile could easily intensify fragmentation. Displacement often deepens tribal loyalties, memory conflicts, and identity competition. Ezekiel imagines something different, a reunified people under renewed covenant reality. The promise also includes leadership language. One king will be over them all. No longer divided rulership. No competing sovereignties, no fractured national identity. Given Ezekiel's context, this naturally evokes Davidic themes. The text speaks of my servant David as future shepherd king language, which scholars interpret in different ways: dynastic restoration hope, idealized Davidic rulership, messianic expectation, symbolic covenant leadership, or theological archetype. What remains clear is a longing for unified, righteous leadership, in contrast to the failures that helped produce catastrophe. The shepherd imagery is especially significant because earlier prophetic traditions often condemned corrupt leaders who exploited rather than protected the people. Restoration, therefore, requires not merely structural unity, but transformed leadership. Another major theme emerges here: covenant renewal. The reunified people will no longer defile themselves with idols and transgressions. Restoration is not merely geopolitical rearrangement, it is moral and spiritual transformation. This is crucial in Ezekiel's theology. The old world did not collapse because borders were poorly managed alone. It collapsed because covenant fidelity was shattered. Any genuine restoration must address the underlying spiritual crisis, not merely reconstruct external structures. This chapter also resonates with earlier biblical promises about cleansing, renewed heart, and transformed obedience. Ezekiel's vision of restoration consistently moves beyond superficial recovery toward deep renewal. Scholars debate the historical horizon of these promises. Were they intended as immediate post-exile hopes, idealized theological visions, eschatological expectations, symbolic identity claims, or layered prophetic imagination extending beyond a single historical moment? Interpretive traditions differ. Some emphasize concrete national restoration language. Others highlight symbolic theological meaning that later communities reinterpreted. For the narrative itself, however, the emotional message is unmistakable. Division is not destiny. Historical fracture is not ultimate. The God who animates dry bones can also heal ancient political wounds. There is also an important literary contrast with earlier chapters. So much of Ezekiel's earlier ministry exposed division between appearance and reality, sacred institution and moral corruption, public confidence and hidden decay. Fragmentation defined the story. Here the imagery reverses that pattern. Separation becomes joining. Scattering becomes gathering. Broken identity becomes coherence. Symbolically, the two sticks are a profoundly simple answer to a profoundly difficult question. Can what history has split apart ever become whole again? Yet we should not romanticize the challenge. Human reconciliation is notoriously difficult. Political division becomes cultural identity. Historical trauma becomes inherited memory. Competing narratives calcify over generations. Ezekiel's promise, therefore, does not read as ordinary political optimism. It reads as divine intervention precisely because the scale of healing exceeds normal human expectation. That is what makes the symbolism compelling. Ezekiel is not proposing a clever diplomatic strategy. He is envisioning transformation that redefines what the community believes possible. For the exile audience, this would have been emotionally staggering. Many were already grieving destruction, displacement, and identity collapse. To hear not merely of survival, but reunification of a people divided for centuries would have sounded astonishing. Restoration becomes larger than return. It becomes reconciliation. And beneath all this lies a deeper theological point. The covenant people belong ultimately not to tribal fragmentation, dynastic rivalry, or imperial classification, but to the God who can reconstitute identity itself. Human history fractures. Divine sovereignty restores. That is Ezekiel's claim. As the prophet holds two joined sticks, the gesture may seem almost quiet compared to earlier visions of fire, wheels, and dry bones. But in emotional terms, it may be just as radical. Because sometimes the greatest miracle is not bringing the dead to life. Sometimes it is teaching the living to become one again. Just when Ezekiel's story appears to be moving steadily toward restoration, unity, and renewed hope, the narrative takes a dramatic and deeply unsettling turn. Because if the people are restored, if the dead can live, if the divided can become one, a haunting question still remains. What happens when evil returns? What if restoration itself becomes vulnerable? What if even after catastrophe, healing, and covenant renewal, chaos rises once more? This is where Ezekiel introduces one of the most mysterious and debated figures in biblical literature, Gog of the land of Magog. Few passages in Scripture have generated more speculation, symbolic interpretation, apocalyptic fascination, and later theological reinterpretation than Ezekiel chapters 38 and 39. And perhaps the first thing we must say is this: certainty here should be approached with caution. Because the text itself is deliberately grand, symbolic, and resistant to simplistic decoding. Yet its emotional and theological function within Ezekiel's story is remarkably clear. Gog is introduced not as an ordinary neighboring king in a conventional political oracle, but as something larger. A climactic enemy figure associated with an overwhelming multinational assault. The names themselves have provoked centuries of debate. Is Gog a historical ruler known under another name? A symbolic archetype of chaos? A literary apocalyptic construct? A mythicized enemy figure using recognizable ancient geopolitical language? Interpretive traditions diverge sharply. Some scholars seek historical analogs among ancient northern threats. Others emphasize symbolic theology rather than direct historical identification. Later readers, especially in apocalyptic traditions, often reinterpreted Gog and Magog in dramatically expanded ways. But within Ezekiel's immediate narrative, the key issue is not modern prediction mapping. It is the theological meaning of ultimate hostile opposition against restored covenant order. Gog comes from the north, the direction often associated in biblical imagination with invasion and threat. He is described with military grandeur, horses, weapons, assembled nations, strategic aggression, overwhelming force. Persia, Cush, Put, Gomer, Beth Togarmah, a coalition of distant powers gathers. The scale is intentionally expansive. This is not a border skirmish. It feels like total confrontation, a cosmic scale crisis emerging after restoration. And the emotional tension is immediate. Why place this after hopeful restoration visions? Because restoration without addressing future threat would remain fragile. The question Ezekiel is forcing is profound. Is restored peace permanent or merely temporary before chaos returns? Gog embodies that anxiety. The imagery is dramatic. Gog plans invasion against a people living in apparent security, unwalled villages, peaceful confidence, vulnerable openness. This detail matters. The restored people are not depicted as paranoid militarists awaiting inevitable violence. They inhabit peace. Gog's aggression, therefore, appears not as defensive realism, but hostile disruption of divinely intended order. The threat feels morally invasive. Yet, the theological surprise is that Gog's movement unfolds within divine sovereignty. Again and again in Ezekiel, hostile powers are not outside the reach of divine control. Even terrifying enemies do not operate beyond the larger moral architecture of history. This is not to deny genuine threat. The danger is vividly portrayed. But sovereignty frames the narrative. The confrontation escalates into spectacular imagery. Earthquake, cosmic disturbance, confusion among invading forces, divine fury, natural catastrophe, fire and judgment. The language becomes highly dramatic, pushing beyond ordinary military reporting into something almost apocalyptic in texture. This is why many scholars see these chapters as transitional toward later apocalyptic imagination, where historical conflict becomes symbolic cosmic struggle between divine order and chaotic opposition. The exact literary category remains debated, but the emotional effect is unmistakable. Gog is not merely another enemy nation. Gog represents concentrated hostile force confronting restored divine order. Modern readers often rush to identify Gog with specific contemporary nations, geopolitical blocs, or future scenarios. This tendency has appeared repeatedly across centuries, with wildly changing candidates depending on the era's anxieties. Historically, such confident identifications have proven remarkably unstable. That should encourage interpretive humility. Ezekiel's original audience did not possess 21st century political maps. The text functions theologically before it functions as speculative prediction material. The more fruitful question is what Gog represents in Ezekiel's narrative world. One compelling reading sees Gog as the embodiment of ultimate anti-covenant hostility, chaos returning after restoration, evil refusing surrender even after judgment. In that sense, Gog functions less as a single decipherable ruler and more as a theological archetype. Another interpretation emphasizes symbolic use of known geographic language to communicate an overwhelming multinational threat, rather than precise cartographic forecasting. Either way, the essential emotional logic remains. Even restored communities fear renewed destruction. Ezekiel addresses that fear directly. There is also an important literary contrast with earlier nation oracles. Those judgments targeted identifiable surrounding powers within historical moral frameworks. Gog feels different, more expansive, more climactic, more symbolically heightened. The enemy is less psychologically specific and more archetypal. That shift matters because Ezekiel's narrative is moving toward larger theological horizons. The question is no longer merely whether Judah survives Babylon. The question becomes whether divine restoration can ultimately withstand cosmic-scale opposition. The answer Ezekiel gives is emphatic: yes. But not because the restored people become militarily invincible through ordinary means. Victory belongs to divine action. This preserves a recurring theological theme. Human security is not grounded in self-sufficiency, imperial imitation, or strategic domination. Divine sovereignty remains central. Another striking element is the aftermath imagery. Weapons become fuel. Burial continues for extended periods. The land is cleansed. The grotesque scale reinforces total defeat of hostile force. Some of this imagery feels deliberately overwhelming, not because Ezekiel intends battlefield logistics analysis, but because the emotional point requires absolute closure. Chaos does not merely retreat, it is decisively neutralized. This matters psychologically. A traumatized people do not need vague reassurance. They need assurance that future threat does not possess ultimate power. Later biblical traditions, especially the Book of Revelation, famously reappropriate Gog and Magog imagery in transformed apocalyptic contexts. This demonstrates the enduring symbolic potency of Ezekiel's vision. But even without those later developments, Ezekiel's own narrative already establishes Gog as larger than ordinary politics, a symbolically charged final enemy through whom divine sovereignty is publicly vindicated. There is another subtle but profound point here. Restoration does not eliminate the conceptual possibility of conflict. Ezekiel is not offering naive utopianism, where history becomes permanently frictionless by simple decree. Instead, he acknowledges that even renewed order may face hostile challenge. Hope is not built on pretending evil no longer exists. Hope is built on the conviction that evil does not ultimately prevail. That distinction gives the vision emotional credibility. Communities shaped by catastrophe rarely trust simplistic optimism. Ezekiel offers something harder and stronger. Yes, threat may appear overwhelming. Yes, chaos may seem to gather again. And still, the final outcome belongs elsewhere. For the broader story, Gog and Magog function as the final great test before the closing temple vision. Restoration has been promised. Unity has been imagined. But before sacred order is fully re-envisioned, the narrative must confront the fear that destruction could simply return. Gog is that fear given narrative form, and when Gog falls, the theological conclusion becomes unmistakable. The God who judged Jerusalem, restored the exiles, raised the dry bones, and reunited the divided people, remains sovereign even over ultimate chaos. Which means the story can now move toward its final and most astonishing question. If evil itself cannot prevent restoration, what does a truly renewed sacred world actually look like? After visions of judgment, exile, devastation, dry bones, restored unity, and the defeat of ultimate hostile forces, Ezekiel arrives at the most architecturally detailed and perhaps most debated vision in the entire book. It begins with extraordinary precision. In the 25th year of exile, 14 years after the fall of Jerusalem, Ezekiel is carried in visionary experience to the land of Israel and set upon a very high mountain. There he sees what appears to be a city-like structure to the south. A figure, radiant and authoritative, stands with measuring instruments in hand. And immediately the tone changes. Gone is the chaotic terror of earlier judgment visions. Gone are the bones, the invaders, the collapse imagery. Now comes measurement. Order, structure, deliberate design. This shift is profoundly meaningful. Trauma produces disorientation. Measurement communicates coherence. The shattered world of exile is being replaced not with vague optimism, but with carefully articulated sacred order. Yet modern readers often encounter these chapters and feel bewildered. Room dimensions, gate structures, courtyards, chambers, priestly regulations, altar measurements, land allocations, endless architectural detail. Why would a prophetic climax spend so much time describing construction specifications? The answer lies deeper than architecture. For Ezekiel, sacred order is not decorative detail. It is theological restoration made visible. To understand the emotional force of this vision, remember what Ezekiel lost. He was a priest by lineage. His identity was shaped around temple imagination, but exile interrupted that life before it could fully unfold. He watched in vision as divine glory departed the corrupted sanctuary. He lived through confirmation of Jerusalem's destruction. For someone formed by priestly consciousness, sacred architecture was not merely symbolic scenery. It represented covenant structure, divine order, liturgical meaning, and communal identity. The temple was where heaven and Israel's life intersected. To receive a new temple vision after catastrophe is therefore not random architectural obsession. It is restoration at the level of deepest symbolic memory. The vision unfolds through guided observation. Ezekiel is shown gates, outer courts, inner courts, thresholds, chambers, measurements repeated with almost ritual insistence. The repetition itself matters. Precision communicates order. Boundaries communicate holiness. Defined space communicates intentionality. This is not chaotic improvisation. Sacred reality has shape. Some modern readers find this tedious precisely because we are conditioned to prioritize emotional narrative over structural symbolism. But for Ezekiel's world, measured sacred space was emotionally charged theology. Order meant meaning, had not vanished. Structure meant chaos was not final. There are several major interpretive approaches to this vision, and intellectual honesty requires acknowledging them. Some read the temple vision as a literal blueprint for future reconstruction. Others see symbolic theology rather than architectural engineering. Some interpret it eschatologically, projecting beyond immediate post-exile history into idealized future fulfillment. Others emphasize literary theological function, portraying restored holiness through visionary symbolism rather than practical construction plans. Jewish and Christian traditions have engaged these chapters differently across centuries. What matters first for Ezekiel's narrative is not forcing premature interpretive certainty, but understanding the vision's function within the story. It answers the question, what does restored sacred order look like after collapse? One of the most emotionally significant moments occurs when divine glory returns. Earlier in the book, Ezekiel witnessed the departure of the glory from the temple in devastating stages. That was one of Scripture's most tragic theological moments. Now, in reversal, the glory returns from the east. The same direction associated with departure becomes the direction of restoration. This is narrative symmetry of extraordinary emotional power. The sanctuary becomes filled with glory. The catastrophe of abandonment is not the final word. Presence returns. For Ezekiel, this is everything. A temple without presence would be architecture without meaning. Restoration requires more than walls. It requires the return of divine presence. The vision also emphasizes holiness boundaries. Distinctions between sacred and common are carefully maintained. Access is regulated. Priestly responsibilities are defined. Certain earlier corruptions are implicitly addressed through renewed order. This reflects one of Ezekiel's enduring theological concerns. The old system did not merely fail politically, it became morally and ritually compromised. Restoration, therefore, cannot be simplistic repetition. Sacred order must be reimagined with transformed seriousness. Modern readers may wrestle with exclusivity, hierarchy, or ritual structure here, especially from contemporary egalitarian assumptions. That tension is understandable, but within Ezekiel's symbolic world, ordered holiness communicates restored relationship rather than arbitrary control. Another striking feature is the river. From the temple threshold flows water, beginning as a small stream, then deepening progressively until it becomes a river impossible to cross. Wherever it flows, life emerges. Trees flourish, waters are healed, even barren regions become productive. This is one of the most beautiful symbolic images in Ezekiel. The temple is no longer merely a static, sacred center. It becomes a source of life. Restoration overflows outward. This dramatically expands the meaning of sacred presence. The earlier temple had been associated with worship and sacrifice. This visionary temple becomes generative, life-giving, transformative. The symbolism is rich enough that later biblical literature will echo it powerfully. The land itself is reorganized. Tribal allocations are redistributed. Sacred geography is restructured. This too matters. Restoration is communal, spatial, and ordered. Exile had shattered identity and land relationship. Ezekiel's vision imagines reconstitution. Yet notably, this is not simple nostalgia. The arrangement differs from earlier realities. The vision is restorative, but not merely backward-looking. Something transformed is being imagined. Scholars often debate how this relates to the actual Second Temple period. Historical reconstruction after exile did occur, but not in a way that neatly matches every detail of Ezekiel's vision. This has fueled interpretive debates for centuries. Was the vision intended literally, but never fully realized historically? Was it symbolic ideal rather than engineering mandate? Was its ultimate referent beyond immediate history? Reasonable interpreters disagree. For documentary storytelling, the more important point is this: Ezekiel's vision functions as theological architecture. It imagines a world where sacred order, divine presence, communal identity, and life-giving restoration are reestablished after total collapse. There is also profound emotional psychology here. Trauma fragments memory and meaning. One response to catastrophe is chaos. Another is the longing for structure. Ezekiel's detailed measurements may reflect more than architectural symbolism. They may also communicate psychological stabilization. In a shattered world, exactness reassures. Boundaries reassure. Ordered, sacred reality reassures. This is not escapist fantasy. It is symbolic reconstruction of meaning itself. The climax comes in the city's new name. The Lord is there. Few phrases capture Ezekiel's journey more perfectly. The story began with exile, dislocation, apparent abandonment, and terrifying divine mobility. The emotional fear beneath everything was absence. Had God left? Had covenant reality ended? Had sacred identity collapsed beyond repair? The final answer is presence. Not merely memory of former glory, but renewed presence. This does not erase interpretive complexity. Ezekiel's temple remains debated precisely because it is so rich, so strange, so architecturally specific, and so theologically ambitious. But its narrative purpose is unmistakable. After judgment comes order. After corruption comes holiness. After exile comes presence. After abandonment comes return. The priest who lost the temple is given a vision of a transformed, sacred world. And yet one final question remains. What lasting legacy does this extraordinary prophet leave behind for everyone who would read his visions centuries later? When we step back from Ezekiel's extraordinary visions, strange, symbolic acts, terrifying judgments, and astonishing promises of restoration, one reality becomes unmistakable. Ezekiel was not merely a prophet speaking to one historical crisis. He became one of the most influential theological voices in the entire biblical tradition, a man whose visions would echo through Judaism, apocalyptic thought, Second Temple theology, and later Christian imagination for centuries. His story began with collapse, but his legacy became transformation. To understand why, we must remember what problem Ezekiel was confronting in the first place. Exile was not simply political displacement. It was a theological emergency. Ancient Judah had tied identity to land, temple, dynasty, and covenant geography. Jerusalem was not just a capital city, it was sacred orientation. The temple was not merely architecture, it was the symbolic center of divine presence. The Davidic monarchy represented covenant continuity. Remove all three, and the entire worldview trembled. Exile raised devastating questions. Had God been defeated? Had covenant promises failed? Could divine presence exist outside sacred geography? Could a people remain the covenant community without the structures that defined them? Ezekiel's answer changed everything. His first great theological revolution was mobility of divine presence. The opening throne vision shattered territorial assumptions. God was not trapped in Jerusalem. Divine glory appeared in Babylon. That single idea was revolutionary. If God could be encountered in exile, then sacred geography, while still meaningful, was no longer an absolute limitation on divine relationship. This theological shift helped create conceptual space for Jewish faith to survive displacement. Without such reimagining, exile could have become total theological collapse. Instead, exile became a context for transformed faith. His second major contribution was moral interpretation of catastrophe. Ezekiel did not portray Jerusalem's fall as evidence of divine weakness. He framed it as covenant judgment. Modern readers may wrestle with aspects of that interpretation, and rightly so. But within the biblical narrative, this reframing preserved divine sovereignty. Babylon did not defeat Yahweh. Yahweh judged Judah through historical events. This allowed catastrophe to be interpreted within moral theology, rather than as random cosmic defeat. Painful as that framework was, it preserved coherence in a shattered world. His third major contribution was radical emphasis on personal accountability. Earlier biblical traditions often emphasized collective identity strongly, and Ezekiel certainly retains communal dimensions. But passages such as the discussion of the righteous son, wicked father, and individual responsibility sharpen a theological principle with remarkable force. The soul who sins shall die. Whatever complexities remain in interpretation, Ezekiel helped articulate a more explicit emphasis on individual moral accountability within covenant discourse. This would become deeply influential in later theological development. Then there is restoration theology. Ezekiel did not merely dismantle illusions, he imagined impossible renewal. Dry bones living again, divided tribes becoming one, hearts transformed, divine spirit renewing inner life, sacred presence returning. His restoration vision was not sentimental nostalgia. It was theological reconstruction after catastrophe. This matters enormously, because communities shattered by trauma do not survive on judgment alone. They need meaningful hope grounded in transformed understanding. Ezekiel supplied that hope, though never cheaply. One of his most enduring contributions lies in the development of resurrection imagination. Historically, the Valley of Dry Bones likely speaks first to corporate restoration in exile context, but symbolic language has a way of generating theological afterlife. Later Jewish thought increasingly developed explicit resurrection expectations, especially in apocalyptic contexts. Ezekiel's imagery became part of that conceptual world. Even where not functioning as direct doctrinal blueprint, his vision expanded what theological imagination considered possible. Death no longer felt symbolically absolute. Ezekiel also profoundly shaped apocalyptic tradition. Gog and Magog, cosmic conflict, overwhelming symbolic visions, supernatural imagery, sacred geography transformed. These themes would echo strongly in later Jewish apocalyptic literature, and eventually in Christian texts such as Revelation. The strange creatures, throne imagery, divine glory symbolism, rivers of life, restored sacred presence. All of these left deep literary fingerprints. Ezekiel became a bridge figure between classical prophetic literature and later apocalyptic imagination. For Second Temple Judaism, this mattered enormously. Jewish identity after exile had to be renegotiated. Temple reconstruction occurred historically, yes, but theological consciousness had changed. Questions of purity, divine presence, covenant identity, restoration, eschatological hope, and national destiny evolved in dialogue with prophetic traditions, including Ezekiel. He helped shape the conceptual vocabulary of post-exile faith. Christian readers later found Ezekiel equally influential. New Testament writers echo his themes repeatedly, though interpreted through new theological lenses. The shepherd imagery resonates. The new heart and spirit themes become central in some Christian theological readings. Revelation draws heavily from Ezekiel's symbolic universe, especially in imagery related to Gog and Magog, restored sacred space, and life-giving waters. Even where interpretive traditions differ, the influence is unmistakable. Yet reducing Ezekiel to theological influence alone would miss his human story. This was not an abstract system builder in a quiet study. This was a displaced priest who lost his homeland before fulfilling his vocation. a man commanded into bizarre public prophetic acts, a husband who endured devastating personal loss, a watchman burdened with warning, a visionary wrestling with terrifying symbolic realities. His theology emerged through trauma, not detached speculation. That gives his work emotional gravity. Scholars continue debating many aspects of Ezekiel: historical reconstruction, literary layers, symbolic interpretation, priestly influence, visionary psychology, temple vision meaning, apocalyptic development, ethical tensions in judgment texts. These debates are legitimate and ongoing. Ezekiel resists simplistic reading precisely because he is so rich, strange, emotionally intense, and theologically ambitious. But regardless of interpretive differences, his significance is undeniable. He expanded the imagination of what prophetic theology could be. There is also a profound psychological legacy in Ezekiel's story. He teaches that collapse does not necessarily mean abandonment, that shattered institutions do not automatically mean divine absence, that judgment and hope can coexist in uncomfortable tension, that identity can survive displacement if reimagined through transformed theological vision. These are not merely ancient religious questions. They are enduring human questions. What happens when the structures that gave life meaning collapse? Can identity survive catastrophe? Can hope exist after institutional failure? Can communities be rebuilt after moral disaster? Ezekiel does not offer easy answers, but he refuses despair as the final conclusion. Perhaps that is why his book remains so compelling. It is strange, yes, sometimes disturbing, often symbolically overwhelming. But beneath the fire, wheels, bones, measurements, and apocalyptic imagery lies a profoundly human story about meaning after collapse. The priest who lost the temple became the prophet who redefined presence. The exile who witnessed destruction became the visionary of restoration. The watchman of judgment became the architect of hope. And in the final line of his great temple vision, the ultimate answer to exile is not merely rebuilt walls, renewed politics, or restored ritual. It is presence. The Lord is there. That is Ezekiel's final legacy. Not simply that catastrophe can be survived, but that even after collapse, divine presence can still redefine the future.